The gymnasium of Lithium Mine Middle School buzzed with restless anticipation as every graduating student gathered for the 10th annual elite recruitment drive. Today marked the moment that would determine their futures. The administration of the Mana Awakening Serum, also known as the Divine Serum. In the Golden Dragon Nation, elites were revered figures, superhumans blessed with magical abilities, and for children born to miners, this was their only chance to escape a life of hardship. The students had spent months imagining glamorous idols arriving to grant them power. So when a group of military elites appeared instead, the excitement dimmed into quiet disappointment. Still, the reality of their presence carried weight. These soldiers were not entertainers, but protectors, defenders against hostile armies and the ever-present threat of magical beasts. Life in the mining town had taught the students enough about danger. Earth mice infested the area, monstrous boars roamed nearby farms, and stronger beasts occasionally appeared, forcing people to hide or die. Power was survival, and the serum was the gateway to it. Among the students sat Karl, nervously fidgeting in his chair. This was the defining moment of his life. If compatible, he would leave the mining town behind and join the Golden Divine Academy to train as an elite. If not, he would remain trapped in the same cycle as everyone before him. After enduring a long speech about duty and national pride, the process finally began. When the nurse approached Karl with the serum, he closed his eyes, expecting a brief sting. Instead, an unbearable agony exploded through his body. It felt as though he was being torn apart from within, his lungs filling with blood as he struggled to breathe. Panic gripped him as he realized something was terribly wrong. The injection was never supposed to feel like this. As his consciousness faded, a grim thought crossed his mind. He might be one of the rare fatalities, the unfortunate few who didn't survive the awakening. But just as quickly as it began, the pain receded. Karl regained consciousness, his body still trembling. The nurse stood before him, her deep crimson eyes fixed on him with a faint smile. She remarked that his survival was a good sign, hinting that such extreme reactions often indicated strong potential. Her appearance unsettled him, the sharp uniform, the unnatural red eyes, yet he couldn't fully process why everything felt slightly off. His vision was blurry and his thoughts sluggish. As the process continued around him, Karl noticed other students receiving their injections with far less dramatic reactions. One girl fainted, but recovered quickly. Meanwhile, his own body felt altered. When he looked down at his arm, he saw that the scars from years of labor in the mines had vanished. In their place were 3 long, deep red marks resembling claw wounds running along his forearm. The marks appeared vivid and raw, yet when he touched them, his skin was smooth and intact. Eventually, silence fell over the room as the procedure ended. At the front, a military officer stepped forward, flanked by the red-eyed nurse and several men in doctor's coats. He announced that the trial had concluded. Those without marks were dismissed, while those who bore them were declared the chosen, prodigies destined to wield supernatural power for the nation. Before the students could fully comprehend this, soldiers flooded the gymnasium, outnumbering the children. Confusion and fear spread as the marked students, including Karl, were escorted away. Many resisted at first, but their weakened bodies made resistance futile. Karl himself struggled to process everything. He had dreamed of becoming powerful, yet he felt anything but strong. His body ached, his mind lagged, and doubt crept in. What if something had gone wrong with his awakening? A soldier approached him, noticing his disorientation, and assured him that rest would fix everything. Too exhausted to argue, Karl allowed himself to be carried away. Soon, he found himself in a luxurious train car, far removed from the harsh conditions of the mining town. The room was comfortable, even extravagant, but before he could reflect on it, sleep overtook him instantly. When Karl awoke, he discovered a small textbook and a stack of papers waiting on the desk. The book, clearly aimed at young students, welcomed newly awakened elites and explained that their powers would not fully manifest until they activated their first skill, It also contained a guide to identifying one's abilities based on the mark they received. Curious, Karl flipped to the section listing various marks. There were clear representations: ice, fire, weapons, shields, and even animal-related symbols, all tied to specific abilities. But none resembled the claw marks on his arm. Confusion deepened as he searched for answers. Even the homework assignment, which required students to describe their abilities, was impossible for him to complete. He didn't know what his power was, let alone how to activate it. Hours passed with no clarity. The other marks seemed straightforward, each pointing clearly to a type of power, but his remained an enigma. The closest comparison, a paw mark linked to druid-like abilities, still didn't match. Frustration began to build. His future depended on this, yet he had no idea what he had become. Realizing he couldn't figure it out alone, Karl finally decided to call for a soldier. If he didn't get answers soon, he might arrive at his destination completely unprepared, still clueless about the very power that was supposed to change his life. Karl sat alone in his private train room, still struggling to understand the strange claw marks etched along his forearm, when activity outside began to shift. Unbeknownst to him, guards were already making their rounds through the train, quietly checking which newly awakened students had regained consciousness. Typically, those with stronger bodies woke up sooner, but it had only been half a day since departure, so no one expected significant progress yet. That was why Karl's early awakening drew attention. A patrol guard reported his status to the commanding general at the front of the train, noting that a boy in room 12A, Karl, with no recorded family name, was already awake. The general immediately asked about his class and whether he had shown any signs of activating his abilities. The answer was troubling. Karl had not demonstrated any skills, and his marking, 3 claw-like streaks, did not match any known classification. This uncertainty sparked concern. The general ordered his assistants to search their records, but after several minutes, no matching class could be found. While similar markings existed, none aligned exactly with Karl's. In the end, the general dismissed the matter with a pragmatic conclusion. The boy would have to awaken on his own. If he failed to do so before reaching the academy, he would likely struggle, or worse, fall behind permanently. Karl, meanwhile, remained unaware of this conversation and the quiet doubt forming around him. Back in his room, he continued to wrestle with confusion and growing unease. The textbook had failed him, offering clear guidance for nearly every mark except his, while others would soon be unlocking abilities tied to recognizable symbols, elements, weapons, or known archetypes. His claw marks felt like an unsolved riddle. The lack of direction weighed heavily on him, especially knowing that this power was supposed to determine his entire future. Beyond Karl's immediate struggles, the world he had just entered operated on a system far larger than he fully understood. The divine serum, the source of his transformation, was not some mystical relic alone, but a carefully engineered creation. It had been developed after researchers studied ancient system stones discovered beneath a world dragon cathedral. Though the original device was broken, the lingering power within it had been harnessed to create the serum, a tool that could awaken latent magical abilities within humans and elevate the Golden Dragon Nation's military strength. This advancement had changed everything. Nations that once relied on elemental advantages, like the ocean people with their water magic, could no longer dominate uncontested. The serum allowed the Golden Dragon Nation to produce its own mages and warriors, capable of battling both human enemies and the monstrous creatures that plagued the world. In essence, the serum had become both a weapon and a symbol of national survival. But power came with its own structure. Those who were compatible with the serum were taken by the military, trained intensively, and shaped into protectors of the nation. Yet, to prevent rebellion or resentment, they were not treated like ordinary soldiers. Instead, they were elevated, granted luxury, status, and privilege. As long as they proved their worth, they would live far above the common people they once were. Karl, without fully realizing it yet, had stepped into a world where power dictated not only survival, but social hierarchy itself. Still, none of that helped him solve the immediate problem. Determined to find answers, Karl finally decided to ask one of the passing guards for help. As the uniformed soldier walked by his room, Karl hesitated only briefly before speaking up, explaining that his mark wasn't listed in the guidebook. The guard's response was blunt but not unkind. The book only covered the most common markings, about 90% of cases. The rest were unpredictable, mysterious outcomes of the divine serum. The advice he gave was simple: try everything, experiment, follow whatever felt natural. Awakening, especially for unusual marks, often required instinct rather than instruction. However, the guard also offered a warning. If Karl failed to awaken his powers before arriving at the academy, he would start at the very bottom. Among elites, power rankings mattered deeply, and first impressions could define one's entire trajectory. Karl pressed further, asking if the guard had ever seen a marking like his. In response, the guard rolled up his sleeve, revealing a bear paw mark, his own symbol as a druid, a nature-based class with ties to animals. Drawing a loose comparison, the guard suggested that Karl's claw marks might also relate to animals or physical combat. Though uncertain, it was the closest lead Karl had received so far. The guard shared his own experience, explaining that he had failed to awaken his abilities during the train journey. It was only when he reached the academy and connected with nature, touching the trees, that his powers finally manifested. That memory carried both reassurance and subtle warning. Awakening was not always immediate, and sometimes it required the right conditions. Karl thanked him, watching as the guard walked away. The conversation left him with more questions than answers, but it also gave him something he desperately needed, a direction, however vague. For the first time since discovering his strange marking, Karl felt a small spark of determination. If there was no clear path, then he would have to carve one himself, just like the claw marks etched into his arm. Karl lay sprawled across his bed, staring out the train window as he tried to make sense of the claw marks etched into his forearm. The guard's earlier suggestion echoed in his mind. His mark likely had something to do with animals. After all, humans didn't leave claw marks like that. That thought became his starting point. With a mix of determination and desperation, Karl raised his hand and attempted the most straightforward idea he could think of, manifesting claws. He even tried shouting, "Claw!" out loud, hoping that maybe abilities required some kind of verbal trigger. Nothing happened. The silence that followed made the attempt feel even more ridiculous, and Karl quickly realized that blindly guessing wouldn't get him anywhere. Unaware that supervisors were watching him through hidden cameras and quietly laughing at his trial-and-error approach, Karl turned back to the textbook for guidance. The section on magic classes instructed him to use casting tools stored beneath his bed, but that didn't seem to match his marking at all. Moving on, he found the section on combat classes, which suggested selecting a weapon from a hidden compartment. That seemed more promising. Kneeling beside the bed, Karl opened the drawer and found an assortment of weapons, some familiar, others completely foreign. There were throwing knives, small crossbows, and even an unusual chained axe that looked more dangerous to the wielder than any opponent. Lacking physical strength and experience, Karl chose a short sword, the simplest option available. The moment he held it, something felt right. Encouraged, he tested a few swings, gradually building confidence before attempting a proper strike toward the door. But instead of any visible effect, a message suddenly appeared in his mind. Pet skills not available. You must record a pet. The words weren't spoken or written. They simply existed in his thoughts, as if implanted there by the system itself. That realization shifted everything. Karl paused, processing the implication. His ability wasn't tied to weapons or direct combat, at least not initially. It revolved around something else, something involving pets. But what did record a pet even mean? Was it as simple as writing something down, memorizing an animal, or did it require something more tangible? The problem became immediately obvious. There were no animals on the train. This wasn't the mining town, filled with pests and wildlife. If his ability required physical interaction with a creature, then he might be stuck until they reached their destination. Still, Karl refused to give up. He turned his attention back to the tools under his bed, this time opening the casting drawer. Inside was a collection of strange items, many of which he couldn't even identify. One object in particular caught his attention, a heavy, baseless glass orb that resembled a decorative snow globe. Curious, he picked it up. The moment he touched it, the orb lit up with a bright white glow, and another message echoed in his mind. Taming space viewing is not available. Please record a pet. This time, the meaning came with a sensation, a vast emptiness forming within his consciousness. It felt like an endless space waiting to be filled, a place meant to house something powerful. Excited by the possibilities, Karl tried to will a creature into existence. A dragon, naturally, was his first thought. If he had access to a taming space, why not start big? But nothing happened. Reality quickly grounded his imagination. This wasn't something he could simply conjure at will. Just as he was lost in thought, a touch on his arm snapped him back to the present. The patrolling guard had returned, noticing the open drawers and the sword lying on the bed. Karl explained his situation honestly. He had found a direction, but he was still missing the key piece needed to activate his abilities. The guard encouraged him, pointing out that even having a lead put him ahead of most other students, who were still unconscious. That small reassurance lifted Karl's spirits slightly. Seizing the moment, Karl asked about food, hoping that a full stomach might help him think more clearly. The guard obliged, guiding him out of his room and down the train. As they passed identical rooms filled with sleeping students, Karl couldn't help but feel both lucky and pressured. He was ahead, but only barely. Eventually, they reached a dining area connected to a kitchen. The cook, busy at work, barely acknowledged them, simply telling Karl to grab whatever he wanted. Karl didn't hesitate. He gathered steaks, rice, vegetables, anything that looked appealing. Then his eyes landed on a pile of unusually large white eggs. On impulse, he picked one up. In that instant, everything changed. A message flashed in his mind. Suitable pet target found, hatching. The egg vanished from his hand, leaving Karl frozen in confusion. Before he could react, a vision unfolded within his consciousness. Inside the vast taming space, a straw nest formed, holding the same white egg. Within seconds, it began to tremble and crack. The suddenness of it startled him so much that he physically stumbled backward, bumping into the guard. Though the event had taken place entirely within his mind, it felt vividly real. The guard, assuming Karl was simply dizzy from hunger, steadied him and led him to a table. As Karl sat down, trying to process what had just happened, the guard casually reassured him that strange sensations were normal after awakening. Their conversation caught the cook's attention, who joined in out of curiosity. When Karl described his claw mark, the guard joked about its size, comparing it to smaller, less impressive markings. The cook then revealed his own mark, a tiny wand symbol on his hand, barely noticeable unless pointed out. He mentioned a theory that the size of a marking might relate to the user's potential, though he wasn't convinced. Karl shared his own guess that his abilities might involve hunting or animal-related combat. It was half serious, half joking, but it was the best theory he had. The cook offered one final piece of advice. Once Karl successfully activated his first skill, he would be able to access a status interface, giving him insight into his abilities and growth. For now, though, everything depended on that first breakthrough. As Karl sat there, staring at his food but barely noticing it, his thoughts were consumed by the image of the cracking egg in his mind. For the first time, his mysterious power felt real and dangerously unpredictable. Karl sat quietly at the table as the cook prepared his meal, but his attention was no longer on the food. Instead, he closed his eyes and focused inward, drawn to the strange space that had formed in his mind when the egg vanished. What greeted him was not words, but impressions, clear, structured information that he instinctively understood how to interpret. The system revealed itself in fragments. His beast space had activated, containing a single occupant. That occupant was identified as a Windspeed Hawk, ranked at the common level with a low connection to him. It possessed 3 skills: Claw, Rend, and Supervision. The moment this information settled in his mind, Karl felt a surge of power flow through his body, as if something within him had finally aligned. Another set of impressions followed, this time about himself. His class was identified as Beastmaster, also at the common rank. His bloodline remained human, but his abilities now included beast skills derived from his contracted creature. Specifically, he had gained access to Supervision and Rend. It was both exhilarating and confusing. The textbook had implied a structured path to awakening, but this felt far more instinctive, almost like piecing together a puzzle without instructions. Karl opened his eyes, his mind racing. He needed context, something to anchor this experience. Turning to the guard and the cook, he asked how power was measured within the system. Their response made things even more complex. There was no universal level indicator visible to others. Unless someone revealed their strength or possessed a rare sensing ability, judging power relied on intuition or public rankings, both of which were subjective. The cook explained his own situation. As a wand class mage specializing in fire, he could only use a single element. If he had been an orb class mage, he could have wielded 2. Yet despite this, his progress had stagnated. He never advanced beyond the first level of his spellbook due to limited talent. Power, it seemed, wasn't just about class type, but about how effectively one could grow within it. The guard added his perspective as a druid. He described himself as a level 6 mortal grade practitioner, capable of various abilities like healing, combat, plant growth, and even transforming into a bear. Despite this versatility, he admitted that he wasn't exceptional at any one skill, which had limited his advancement. His rank had only reached the awakened grade, allowing him to fight similarly ranked magical beasts, but not excel beyond that. From their explanations, Karl began to understand the ranking system. Humans were measured against magical beasts, with ranks progressing from common upward to more powerful tiers like awakened, ascended, commander, and beyond. It wasn't a rigid level system, but rather a comparative scale based on combat capability or effectiveness in support roles. Curious, Karl asked about the strongest students they had known. The cook immediately mentioned Archmage Mia, a former classmate who had become a national idol. She had reached the awakened rank within her first year, surpassed ascended beasts by her second, and graduated as a commander-grade mage. Shortly after, she advanced to royal rank, cementing her fame. Her rapid rise illustrated the vast gap between ordinary elites and true prodigies. The mention of royal rank sent a chill through Karl. Even imagining such power was overwhelming. A being at that level could easily destroy his entire hometown without effort. The strongest figure he knew back in the mining town, the mayor, was only a commander-grade warrior, and even he seemed too old to handle serious threats. The scale of power Karl had entered was far greater than he had ever imagined. After finishing his meal, Karl thanked the two men and returned to his room, his mind heavy with both determination and realization. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. As he walked, he reflected on something simple yet profound. The hardest part of any task wasn't starting, but continuing. Motivation faded, progress slowed, and doubt crept in. That was when most people failed. He had seen it in the miners, heard it from the foreman, and now understood it in the context of his own journey. Back in his room, Karl wasted no time. Sitting by the window, he decided to test one of his newly acquired abilities. He focused on supervision, activating it with intent rather than words. Instantly, the world transformed. The distant forests became sharply detailed, as if they were just outside the window. His peripheral vision expanded, capturing everything around him with equal clarity. Movement in the distance caught his attention, a quill beast roaming the grasslands over a kilometer away. The level of detail was astonishing. Colors became richer, more complex, extending into spectrums he couldn't even name. It wasn't just enhanced sight, it was something far beyond human capability. The Windspeed Hawk's vision allowed him to perceive ultraviolet and infrared light, and even function effectively in low-light conditions. The realization struck him deeply. While Rend sounded like the more impressive combat skill, supervision might actually be the more valuable ability, offering advantages in both survival and strategy. Karl couldn't help but imagine the possibilities. In practical tests, this ability alone could give him a massive edge. Even in written exams, the temptation to exploit it crossed his mind briefly, though he quickly dismissed the idea, partly out of pride, and partly because he doubted his former classmates would have answers worth copying anyway. For the first time since receiving the divine serum, Karl felt a sense of control. His power wasn't just real, it was usable, and more importantly, it was his. Karl finally allowed himself a brief moment of relief after successfully activating his first abilities, but that sense of accomplishment didn't last long. The homework sheet waiting on his desk quickly reminded him that awakening power was only the beginning. He still had to document and present it properly before arriving at the academy. Sitting down with a pen in hand, Karl began filling out the form. His name and age were simple enough, but when he reached the section asking for his skill, he hesitated. There was only space for one entry, which suggested that most students only awakened a single ability at this stage. That realization forced him into a difficult decision. He had multiple options: his Beast Master class, the passive Supervision, and the combat-focused Rend, but revealing everything could make him a target. Karl thought carefully about how others would perceive him. If he wrote down Beast Taming, it would reveal that his power relied on a creature, and worse, that his current companion was nothing more than a newly hatched bird. That would almost certainly invite ridicule or bullying. On the other hand, Supervision was undeniably useful, but it lacked the raw combat appeal that elite students valued most. In a system where strength determined status, a non-combat ability might not earn him much respect. That left Rend. Determined to confirm its effectiveness, Karl stood and retrieved the short sword once more. This time, instead of hesitation, he activated the skill with a single, focused thought. The blade immediately glowed with a dull red light, and as he swung it toward the designated testing area on the wall, A crescent-shaped arc of destructive energy surged forward. The attack was absorbed by the high-tech alloy, but the power behind it was unmistakable. The sensation, however, was far from effortless. Using Rend felt like forcing his arm through thick resistance, as though he were dragging it through dense dough. His movements slowed significantly during the activation, making the attack powerful but not yet efficient. Still, Karl could already see its potential. With training, the speed and fluidity would improve, allowing him to strike faster and more effectively. Encouraged, he returned to the desk and began filling in the details. He carefully described the skill's strengths and limitations, including the reduced movement speed during activation. At the same time, his mind began exploring ways to overcome that weakness. If he could combine movement with activation, like how a hawk dives at high speed before striking, he might be able to unleash Rend more effectively. The idea lingered, planting the seeds of future growth. The questionnaire didn't stop at abilities. It also asked about physical and mental changes, headaches, memory issues, or bodily enhancements. Karl paused to evaluate himself. Aside from his enhanced vision, he noticed a slight increase in flexibility. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Still, he chose not to report it. Keeping certain details hidden felt like the safer option, especially when he didn't fully understand the implications of his transformation. He recalled how inconsistent the serum's effects could be. Some elites became physically monstrous, while others remained fragile despite wielding immense power. Even famous figures weren't immune. He remembered hearing about an idol who had sprained an ankle during a public event. That alone proved that physical enhancement wasn't guaranteed, no matter how powerful someone's abilities were. Satisfied with his answers, Karl sealed the completed assignment in the provided envelope and placed it in the collection tray by the door. Officially, he had done everything required of him. But stopping now didn't sit well with him. If anything, successfully activating Rend had only fueled his curiosity. Returning to the weapon drawer, Karl began experimenting again. The sword had worked, but it didn't quite match the imagery of his claw-like marking. Searching for alternatives, he found a pair of gauntlets fitted with clawed tips. They seemed like a better match, mimicking the shape of his mark more closely than any blade. After adjusting the straps to fit his slightly smaller hands, Karl extended his arm and activated Rend once more. This time, instead of a single, powerful arc, multiple thin streaks of red energy shot forward from his fingers. Each individual strike was weaker than the sword's attack, but they were significantly faster and covered a wider area. The difference was immediately clear. The sword offered power, while the gauntlets provided speed and versatility. Against lightly armored opponents, the gauntlets could overwhelm defenses with multiple rapid strikes. It wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about understanding how each method could be used effectively. However, the repeated use of the skill quickly revealed another limitation. With each activation, Karl felt his energy draining. After only a handful of attempts, his arms grew heavy and exhaustion set in. He was forced to sit down, catching his breath as he realized how taxing his abilities were. That weakness concerned him. While he had trained his body before, it had been for strength and appearance, not endurance. Combat would demand far more than he was used to. Still, instead of discouraging him, the realization gave him direction. This was exactly what the academy was for, to refine both his power and his body until they could support each other. As Karl sat there, massaging his sore arms, a faint noise from the hallway caught his attention. Other students were beginning to wake up, their own journeys just starting. Compared to them, Karl had gained a small but significant head start. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough. And in a world where power determined everything, even the smallest advantage could make all the difference. The announcement came just after breakfast on the second day since Karl had awakened, breaking the quiet routine he had begun to settle into. The train's voice instructed all new students to gather their preferred weapons, uniforms, and prepare to disembark in 5 minutes. The Golden Divine Academy was finally within reach. Karl moved quickly, packing the snacks he had carefully collected from the kitchen into his provided backpack, along with spare uniforms and shoes. He strapped on the black clawed gauntlets and secured the short sword at his hip. No one had told him he couldn't carry multiple weapons, and since neither the guards nor the staff had objected to his earlier practice, he saw no reason to limit himself now. If anything, flexibility might give him an edge. The train came to a gradual stop, but not at the academy gates. Instead, it halted roughly a kilometer away, leaving a wide stretch of open grassland between the students and their destination. Karl immediately suspected that this was intentional, a test disguised as tradition. The cook and the guard had hinted at a walk, but now it was clear that this final approach was meant to challenge them. A slender guard addressed the group once they stepped off the train, welcoming them to the academy and explaining the traditional walk. His warning about the deceptively empty grasslands was enough to put Karl on alert. This wasn't just a scenic stroll, it was a controlled trial. As Karl stepped onto the field, the difference in environment struck him immediately. The air was clean, filled with the scent of trees and flowers instead of mining dust. More importantly, he could feel something else, a faint but undeniable pressure emanating from the academy itself. It wasn't visible, but it lingered like a presence, something powerful and unnatural. While most students hesitated or lingered in confusion, Karl moved forward, activating his supervision to scan the terrain. What appeared empty at first glance quickly revealed itself to be teeming with life. Beneath the grass, clusters of earth rats, common-grade magical beasts, shifted and burrowed. He recognized them immediately. They were familiar pests from his hometown, though here they were far more numerous. They weren't particularly dangerous individually, but in large numbers, they could become a serious problem. Then, a voice echoed in his mind. Mice, hungry. It was the Windspeed Hawk. The sensation carried urgency, almost impatience. The creature inside his beast space wasn't just aware of the mice, it craved them. That instinctive hunger aligned perfectly with Karl's situation. If he was going to cross this field, he might as well make use of it. Stepping forward into the grasslands, Karl prepared himself for his first real test as an awakened elite. It wasn't a grand battlefield or a heroic duel, just a field filled with small, aggressive creatures. Still, it was enough. The reaction was immediate. Earth rats began emerging from their burrows, launching small stones toward him using their innate magic. The attacks were crude but numerous, forcing Karl to act quickly. With a flick of his fingers, he activated Rend through his gauntlets. 4 sharp red arcs of energy shot forward, striking multiple targets with precision. Thanks to supervision, every movement was clear. He could track the rats as they darted, burrowed, or attempted to escape. One fell instantly, another was caught mid-retreat, and a third was struck just as it tried to dive underground. The coordination between his vision and attack felt seamless, almost natural. Without hesitation, Karl jogged forward and collected the fallen bodies, transferring them into his beast space. Inside, the Windspeed Hawk fed, its hunger momentarily satisfied. Almost immediately, the number of attacks directed at Karl decreased. The remaining rats sensed the presence of a predator and shifted their focus to other students. Only a few continued to throw stones at him from a distance, but these were easily deflected with his armored gauntlets. Compared to the chaos around him, Karl's advance became surprisingly smooth. Behind him, a voice broke through the tension. A dark-haired girl with a wand complained about his apparent advantage, calling his gauntlets a cheat code in an open field like this. Karl glanced back, noting her frustration. Unlike him, she relied on traditional magic, which came with heavy energy costs. He pointed out the obvious. She was a mage, capable of casting spells, but her response revealed a harsh reality. Magic wasn't as effortless as it seemed. She could only cast a few spells before collapsing from exhaustion, making prolonged combat risky. Karl understood that all too well. He had experienced similar limitations early on. Still, his energy consumption had already begun to stabilize with use. It was likely something that improved with practice. Thinking quickly, Karl offered her a simple solution. She could stay behind him and use his position as cover. By loosening her coat and obscuring her face, she could reduce the likelihood of being targeted. The earth rats weren't particularly intelligent. They reacted to visible threats. If she stayed hidden and let Karl handle the front line, she could conserve her strength. The moment Karl and the dark-haired mage demonstrated their strategy in the grasslands, the rest of the students quickly adapted. Groups began forming almost instinctively, each cluster organizing itself around strengths and weaknesses. Most of the newly awakened elites carried melee weapons, suggesting that warrior-type classes were the most common. A few students, equipped with shields, naturally took the lead in their groups, acting as the front line, while those with ranged abilities or magic stayed behind. The more vulnerable students, especially mages, were placed in the center, protected from incoming attacks. Karl noticed that 2 more classmates joined their group, mimicking the mages' tactic of hiding their faces beneath their coats, even though they didn't fully understand why it worked. To the earth mice, however, the effect was immediate and dramatic. What had once been a single threatening figure Karl, with his clawed gauntlets, now appeared as a small group of faceless, unnatural figures advancing together. The illusion of danger overwhelmed the creature's instincts, and instead of attacking, they began to scatter in fear. This shift allowed Karl's group to move forward at a steady pace, crossing the majority of the field without much resistance. By the time they reached the first hedgerow, they paused briefly to recover their stamina. The moment of rest brought conversation, and with it, a better understanding of each other's abilities. One of the boys, wielding a large axe, admitted that his skill could only be used once before he was completely drained. However, his natural strength, honed from years of labor as a woodcutter's son, allowed him to fight effectively even without relying on his ability. Karl found that reassuring. Raw physical strength still had value in this world, even among the magically empowered. The mage shared a similar limitation. She could cast 2 spells at most before exhaustion forced her to stop, though a short rest would allow her to recover enough for another cast. Karl compared their experiences to his own, explaining that he could use Rend several times as long as he didn't overextend himself. Beyond that, he too would need rest or food to recover. Another warrior in the group revealed an unusual situation. His marking indicated a defensive skill tied to a shield, yet he had no aptitude for using one. Strangely, he could activate the skill while wielding a 2-handed sword instead, maintaining a constant defensive effect. The downside was his lack of speed, which made it difficult to deflect fast-moving attacks like the Earth Mice's projectiles. Listening to everyone, Karl quickly assessed their strengths. They had a physically powerful axe wielder, a durable swordsman with a defensive skill, a limited but useful mage, and himself, a beastmaster with ranged claw attacks and enhanced vision. It wasn't a perfect team, but it was balanced enough to handle most threats they might encounter. After their short break, the group moved forward again, this time with more caution. They no longer concealed their faces, knowing that if stronger creatures appeared, visibility would be critical. Karl activated supervision, scanning the terrain ahead. The field appeared empty, but that didn't reassure him. If anything, it suggested that whatever lived here hadn't been disturbed yet. The mage proposed an alternative route through the nearby trees, hoping to avoid potential dangers in the open field. Karl immediately rejected the idea after carefully observing the tree line. Using his enhanced sight, he had already noticed signs of something far more dangerous: deep gouges in the bark of trees at varying heights. These markings were unmistakable: boars. More specifically, creatures similar to the iron tusk boars he had seen near his hometown. Whether they were the exact same species or a stronger variant, the evidence was clear enough. Entering the forest would mean walking directly into their territory. The group accepted his judgment without argument. With a mix of determination and humor, the axe-wielding boy jokingly declared them valiant scapegoats for the freshman class, pushing forward to entertain the unseen seniors who were likely watching their progress. Despite the light-hearted tone, everyone understood the risk. This wasn't just tradition. It was a trial designed to test their instincts, cooperation, and adaptability. They advanced at a controlled pace, careful not to make excessive noise or vibrations that might provoke hidden threats. Behind them, other groups hesitated, rested, or chose alternative routes. Some likely believed the direct path was a trap, and in truth, they weren't entirely wrong. But Karl knew that avoiding danger didn't guarantee safety elsewhere. About halfway across the field, the situation changed. Another group of students, eager to catch up, began running toward the leaders. Their heavy footsteps disturbed the ground, and almost instantly, the field came alive. Vines burst from the earth, wrapping around the newcomers' legs and pulling them down. Additional tendrils whipped through the air, striking at their faces. Karl immediately recognized the pattern. This wasn't random vegetation. It was a plant-type magical creature, awakened by the disturbance. Unlike the earth mice, this threat was more reactive than aggressive. It responded to movement and intrusion rather than actively hunting. Realizing this, Karl quickly gave instructions to his group. They needed to keep moving calmly and avoid unnecessary contact. Attacking recklessly would only escalate the situation. The mage, clearly uneasy, followed his lead but couldn't resist making a quiet remark, half joking and half serious, that if things went wrong, she would blame him entirely. Despite her words, she stayed close, trusting his judgment. Karl and his group moved carefully through the field, following his earlier instruction to avoid disturbing the vines. For a moment, it seemed like their cautious approach would carry them safely to the end. But just as they neared the hedgerow, everything unraveled. A single misstep changed the situation instantly. The defensive swordsman accidentally stepped on a vine, triggering a sharp reaction. As he stumbled, his blade lashed out and sliced through several vines at once. That single act turned a passive threat into an active one. Karl immediately recognized the danger and shouted for everyone to move, knowing that the plant creature would respond aggressively now that it had been attacked. They broke into a sprint. Vines surged upward from the ground, grasping at their legs and ankles. Karl pushed forward with quick, controlled steps, narrowly avoiding being entangled. Just as he thought he had escaped their reach, a vine caught him and brought him to a sudden halt. The moment froze for an instant, but chaos followed immediately. From behind, the mage made a split-second decision. Using Karl's back as a stepping point, she attempted to vault past him toward safety. It was a clever idea in theory, but poorly executed. Midair, she was snared by the vines and slammed to the ground, the impact knocking the breath out of her. The swordsman, despite his earlier mistake, kept his composure and cut through the vines around him, even managing to joke about the failed maneuver. Karl wasted no time. Activating Rend, he sliced through the vines, restraining him, then immediately freed the mage as well. Together, they scrambled toward the edge of the field. The woodcutter's son was the last to escape, but his experience proved invaluable. Unlike the others, he knew how to deal with entangling vines, striking them with the back of his axe to prevent them from wrapping around his legs. His familiarity with such hazards allowed him to avoid being caught entirely. Once they reached the safety of the trees, the tension eased slightly. The woodcutter apologized for not explaining his technique earlier, but Karl dismissed the concern. There had been no time for instruction in the middle of a crisis. Each of them had relied on their own instincts and knowledge, and that was what had gotten them through. Ahead of them lay the final stretch, a neatly maintained area of short grass with a single cobblestone path leading directly to the academy gates. Compared to everything they had just endured, it looked almost peaceful. Still, none of them took it lightly. The mage, brushing dirt from her uniform, suggested they stick to the path. Her reasoning was simple, almost humorous. Wealthy places didn't like people walking on their grass. Karl found himself agreeing, even if her logic was more instinctive than strategic. After everything they had faced, following the path felt like the safest and most reasonable choice. They advanced together, their pace steady but cautious. The swordsman tried to hide a slight limp from his earlier fall, while the mage did her best to restore some dignity to her appearance. Despite their exhaustion, there was a shared sense of accomplishment among them. They had made it this far, not through raw power alone, but through cooperation and adaptability. When they finally reached the gates, they were greeted by two teachers waiting with supplies. The moment carried a quiet sense of achievement. Out of all the students, they had arrived first. The teachers welcomed them by name, Karl, Dana, James, and Kruger, and informed them that their early arrival granted them a significant advantage. They would be the first to choose their dormitory rooms. A map was laid out before them, along with tokens to claim their selections. As they examined the layout, confusion quickly set in. The rooms varied wildly in design, with no obvious hierarchy. Some were large with simple interiors, while others had unusual features, like oversized balconies or built-in training areas. Kruger, the axe wielder, struggled to make sense of the layout, while Dana quickly identified a narrow room equipped with a long-range training target, perfect for practicing her spells. Karl, on the other hand, was drawn to a room with a large balcony. It offered open space, something he instinctively valued for both his combat style and his growing connection with his beast. Without hesitation, he claimed it. The others followed suit. Dana selected the training room, while James and Kruger chose the larger, shared-style rooms with training dummies. Each decision reflected their individual strengths and priorities, reinforcing the roles they had already begun to establish within the group. As Karl finalized his choice, he felt a subtle reaction from within his beast space. The Windspeed Hawk responded with clear excitement. Through Karl's senses, it perceived the balcony as a perfect environment, open, accessible, and ideal for flight once it matured. The connection between them deepened further when the hawk, still fueled by its recent meal, asked a simple question. Were there more mice? Karl couldn't help but find the thought strangely amusing. The creature's priorities were straightforward: eat, grow, hunt. It was a predator at its core, even in its infancy. He reassured it that more food would come later, promising to provide as much meat as it needed. The hawk's hopeful response lingered in his mind, fixated on the idea of more mice. Karl and the others had barely finished claiming their rooms when one of the teachers approached him with a curious look, questioning his choice. The balcony room, from the outside, seemed unimpressive, barely more than a bedroom. But Karl calmly explained his reasoning. His abilities required space, especially for practicing wide-area attacks like Rend, and the balcony would provide exactly that. Compared to his cramped home in the mining town, even this modest room felt more than sufficient. The teacher handed over their keys with a polite smile, though something about the expression made Karl uneasy. It felt as if they had unknowingly made a mistake, but none of them could pinpoint what it might be. Their choices had seemed logical, each selecting rooms suited to their abilities or preferences. If there was a hidden catch, it hadn't revealed itself yet. As they moved away from the reception area, 3 senior students joined them. Their uniforms bore distinct badges: white, black, and bronze, indicating their ranks. Karl realized for the first time that the badges weren't merely decorative. White represented common grade, black signified awakened, and bronze marked ascended elites. It was a clear, visible hierarchy, one that the new students had only just begun to enter at the lowest level. The bronze-badged senior, clearly the leader, welcomed them and began guiding them through the dormitory. His tone carried a hint of amusement, as if he was anticipating their reactions. He explained the layout: cafeteria to the right, laundry to the left, supply room nearby, and emphasized that while the academy provided resources, it was not a place of luxury service. Students were responsible for maintaining their own spaces, and failure to meet standards would result in collective punishment. The lack of an elevator and the mention of multiple staircases sounded inconvenient, but the senior's smirk made Karl suspicious. It felt like another subtle prank, part of the academy's culture of testing and misdirection. When they reached the second floor, the group split briefly as the warriors, James and Kruger, checked their rooms first. The moment they opened the doors, their reactions confirmed that appearances were deceiving. The main rooms were completely bare, marked with scorch marks and cuts from previous occupants. At the center stood a stone golem, serving as a training dummy. The seniors seemed impressed, noting that the golems were commander-grade constructs, far beyond anything the new students could damage. It was both a blessing and a warning. While the room required significant cleaning, it offered a training tool that could last for years. Karl couldn't shake the feeling that the room conditions weren't random. When he questioned the seniors, they simply smirked and deflected, suggesting he would understand soon enough. Next, they visited Dana's room. As expected, it was tailored for a mage. The entrance contained a compact living space with basic amenities, but beyond that stretched an impossibly long training corridor, far larger than the building's exterior dimensions should allow. The magical nature of the dormitory became undeniable. Space itself seemed to bend to suit each student's needs. Dana's room was also pristine, complete with a welcoming potion left behind by the previous occupant. Compared to the warriors' rooms, the difference was striking. Some rooms required effort and cleanup, while others offered immediate comfort. The pattern hinted at something deliberate, though Karl still couldn't fully grasp the logic behind it. Finally, they reached Karl's room. At first glance, it seemed underwhelming. A narrow entrance, a small bathroom, and a plain main room with a metal desk and a large bed. The dark gray walls gave it a slightly unsettling atmosphere, and one of the seniors jokingly referred to the previous occupant as a kitchen witch, clearly unimpressed. But Karl wasn't concerned with appearances. The moment the seniors left and the door closed, he moved straight to the balcony. What he found there changed everything. Instead of a simple outdoor space, Karl stepped into what could only be described as a greenhouse. Plants filled the area: flowers, vines, small trees, all arranged in a space far larger than it should have been. The balcony extended well beyond the visible structure of the building, its magical nature undeniable. The Windspeed Hawk reacted immediately, its excitement echoing through Karl's mind. The environment was perfect: open air, natural cover, and space to grow. For a creature that would soon learn to fly, it was ideal. As Karl explored further, he discovered a small gazebo at the far end, complete with a hammock and a table. On the table lay a worn notebook. Curious, he opened it and began to read. The contents were both helpful and concerning. The previous resident had documented the care of the greenhouse, explaining that every plant served a purpose. Most were edible, designed to support growth and recovery, but others had more unconventional uses. There was a plant that attracted feline-type magical beasts, another that could lure bear-like creatures, and even a fruit that enhanced mental clarity for exams, but only in limited doses. It became clear that the former occupant had used the garden not just for survival, but for strategy, cheating, sabotage, and manipulation. Karl couldn't help but smile at the realization. Whoever had lived here before him had been resourceful, if not a little reckless. The balcony wasn't just a training space. It was a hidden advantage, one that could be used in ways far beyond what the Academy likely intended. Just then, the Windspeed Hawk again asked Karl for some mice. Karl stood on the balcony of his unusual dorm room, scanning the surroundings with supervision, but no matter how carefully he searched, there were no signs of rodents anywhere. The Windspeed Hawk made its disappointment very clear in his mind, complaining about the complete absence of mice. Even with the ability to detect faint traces like heat signatures and scent trails, there was simply nothing to be found. The magical dormitory environment was too clean, too controlled. Karl sighed and gave in to the inevitable solution: food from the cafeteria. He made his way down to the main floor, where the dining hall was already open. Behind the counter stood an older woman who immediately noticed him as unfamiliar. When Karl politely introduced himself, she seemed pleased enough and explained the rules. Students could eat as much as they wanted, but only white plates were allowed to be taken back to their rooms, and they had to be returned later. It was a practical system, especially considering how unpredictable the appetites of newly awakened elites could be. The Hawk's reaction to the cafeteria was immediate and overwhelming. Meat! Its excitement surged through Karl's mind as it fixated on a section of raw ingredients, particularly the pile of uncooked fish and meat. The cafeteria was divided into prepared meals and raw supplies, giving students flexibility in how they ate. Karl, amused by the urgency of his companion, grabbed 2 white plates and began filling them. For himself, he chose pasta with cream sauce, roasted pork, and a strange vegetable that radiated a sense of energy just from its scent. For the Hawk, he piled an entire plate with raw meat. The cafeteria worker raised an eyebrow at the unusual combination, but simply reminded him that he could have food prepared however he liked in the future. Back in his room, Karl barely had time to set the plates down before the Hawk began pleading. Its hunger was almost comically intense. Fortunately, despite being newly hatched, the Windspeed Hawk was already equipped with a sharp, metallic beak capable of tearing through flesh and bone. The bird devoured the meat at an astonishing rate. Within minutes, it consumed several times its own body weight, visibly growing stronger as it absorbed the nutrients. Even then, it wasn't satisfied, eyeing Karl's meal with desperate intent. Relenting slightly, Karl offered it a single meatball, warning that it would have to wait afterward. The Hawk complained about starvation and then immediately fell asleep. Karl couldn't help but find the contradiction amusing. When the Hawk awoke later, it had grown noticeably, now roughly the size of a sparrow. It flitted around within Karl's beast space, energetic and restless. Meanwhile, Karl turned his attention to the balcony garden. He began cleaning fallen leaves and organizing them for drying, realizing that even the smallest parts of the plants might hold value as magical resources. However, uncertainty lingered. He didn't know whether the garden was officially sanctioned by the Academy or if using its resources might cause trouble. Still, the potential was too great to ignore. The Hawk, of course, had simpler concerns. It immediately asked if it was time for dinner again, specifically requesting something crunchy. Karl agreed to head back to the cafeteria soon, but decided to take care of something else first. He sat down to write a letter. Karl wanted to inform his parents that he had safely arrived and was settling in well. Though communication methods like phones existed, they were far beyond what his family could afford. A simple letter would have to do. As he wrote, his thoughts drifted toward the future. If he succeeded as an elite, he could earn enough to change his family's life, perhaps even move them out of the mines entirely. Once finished, he placed the letter in the collection box by his door, trusting that the system would handle delivery just as it had on the train. When Karl returned to the cafeteria for dinner, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The hall was now packed with students, most of them in rough condition. Torn uniforms, mud-stained clothes, and visible injuries told a clear story. The journey through the fields had been far harsher for many of them. Compared to them, Karl's group had fared exceptionally well. He collected his food quietly, slipping a whole roast chicken into his beast space for the hawk before preparing another plate for himself. As he sat down, a voice called out to him. A blonde girl with a bruised face spoke, recognizing him as the gauntlet guy from earlier. Karl was surprised by her condition and asked what had happened. She explained that her group had handled the earth mice well enough, but had taken a different route afterward, choosing the tree line to avoid the plant monster. Unfortunately, that decision led them straight into the territory of monstrous boars. When she introduced herself as Jasmine, Karl was momentarily stunned. He hadn't recognized her at all. Her appearance had changed drastically. Her hair color was different, and her body was noticeably slimmer than before. It wasn't just her. As Karl looked around, he noticed that many students seemed altered in subtle but significant ways. Even he felt different. Glancing down at himself, Karl realized that his own body had changed as well. He felt taller, and his uniform no longer fit the same way it had that morning. The divine serum hadn't just granted powers, it had reshaped them physically, enhancing their bodies in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The next morning marked the official beginning of training at the academy. But instead of structured classes, the students were instructed to remain in their rooms and wait for their assigned instructors. Karl found the arrangement surprisingly relaxed compared to anything he had known before. The idea that teachers would come to them instead of forcing them into rigid schedules felt almost unreal, reinforcing just how different elite life truly was. Still, the waiting quickly became tedious. Karl passed the time in his balcony greenhouse, alternating between practicing his rend skill and resting. He pushed himself to improve its speed and accuracy, but after repeated use, exhaustion inevitably set in. Even after a short nap, he found himself uncertain about what to do next. The textbooks he had been given offered no real guidance on how to progress beyond basic activation. For someone who had finally gained power, the lack of direction was frustrating. Meanwhile, the Windspeed Hawk continued to grow at an impressive rate. Karl fed it generously at breakfast, another roasted chicken and raw meat, but its appetite had begun to stabilize slightly after its rapid growth. Despite its small size, the hawk was already proving itself to be a dangerous predator. Its natural affinity for rend meant that, with enough mastery, it could eventually strike down creatures stronger than itself. That potential fascinated Karl. The idea that a relatively small creature could defeat higher-ranked opponents purely through skill hinted at just how powerful his class could become. By midday, Karl was growing restless. The knock on his door finally broke the monotony. Opening it, he was greeted by a sharp-featured woman in military attire. She introduced herself as Sergeant Rita, his combat skills professor and personal guidance instructor. Her presence immediately set the tone. This was not going to be an easy or lenient training experience. While she wasn't unkind, there was a clear intensity about her, the kind that suggested discipline and hard work would be non-negotiable. Rita explained that Karl's class was unusual, too different from standard warrior types to fit neatly into group instruction. As a result, he would receive more personalized training, at least for now. It was both an opportunity and a responsibility. When she asked where they could train, Karl offered the balcony. The greenhouse-like environment might have seemed unconventional, but given the academy's already strange and magical architecture, it felt appropriate enough. Rita followed him outside, her attention immediately drawn not to the plants themselves, but to their condition. She questioned whether they had been recently watered, and Karl explained that he had followed the instructions left behind, unsure when they had last been tended. Rita seemed mildly impressed, noting that he had been fortunate to receive such a unique living space. The balcony, with its open design and magical properties, was clearly more valuable than it had initially appeared. Once settled in the gazebo, Rita shifted her focus to the main purpose of her visit. She asked Karl to explain everything about his abilities, his physical changes, skill development, and any additional observations. Her tone was direct and honest, even going as far as to admit that certain classes, like summoners or construct users, were generally more desirable than others. However, she acknowledged that Karl's ranged attack capability gave him a solid starting point. Her straightforwardness caught Karl off guard, but it also earned his trust. Realizing that hiding information would only limit his growth, Karl decided to reveal everything. Focusing inward, he summoned the Windspeed Hawk from his beast space. The small bird appeared in the physical world, its presence immediately drawing Rita's attention. Karl explained how his ability worked, how he had hatched the hawk from an egg, how it lived within a mental space connected to him, and how their thoughts were linked. He described how contracting with the hawk had granted him access to its abilities, including rend and enhanced vision. Rita listened carefully, processing the implications. She quickly identified the strengths and risks of his class. While the ability to bond with monsters and use their skills was powerful, it also meant relying on creatures that might not always be suited for direct combat. A Windspeed Hawk, while deadly, was not a frontline fighter. Karl countered by emphasizing their connection. With shared thoughts and coordination, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The hawk wasn't just a tool, it was a partner. Rita seemed to accept that, but her next suggestion shifted the conversation. She proposed that Karl acquire another beast, something stronger, better suited for combat. Expanding his collection would increase his versatility and overall strength. From her perspective, it was a practical and logical step. The hawk, however, took it personally. Its indignant screech echoed both audibly and within Karl's mind, filled with outrage at the idea of being replaced so soon after its birth. It declared, with absolute confidence, that it would one day reach commander rank, far surpassing Rita's current level. Karl, caught between amusement and embarrassment, translated the message for her. Rita's reaction was immediate, a sharp glare directed at Karl, despite his insistence that he was merely relaying the hawk's words. Still, the exchange revealed something important. The hawk wasn't just intelligent. It had pride, ambition, and a clear sense of identity. That realization intrigued Rita. She noted that such coherent thought at such an early stage was unusual, further reinforcing the uniqueness of Karl's class. Rather than dismissing the hawk, she seemed to grow more interested in its potential. Finally, she suggested moving their training to the academy grounds. It was time to see what Karl and his partner could truly do together, not in theory, but in practice. Sergeant Rita wasted no time. She led him out of the dormitory and across the academy grounds toward a massive open coliseum. The structure had once been a football stadium, repurposed into a combat arena after the creation of the Divine Serum. Now, it stood as a proving ground for elites, reinforced with magical barriers and armored plating strong enough to withstand even commander-grade attacks. To Karl, it felt overwhelming. The sheer scale of the arena made his earlier practice sessions seem insignificant. Here, there were no limits, no confined spaces, just an open battlefield where he could truly test his abilities. Rita explained that when empty, the arena was ideal for training. He could send his hawk as far as needed, and they could spar without risk of serious damage. Then she gave the simplest instruction possible: attack first. Karl took a steady breath, focusing his thoughts. He summoned the Windspeed Hawk, which immediately took to the sky, climbing high above the arena and circling like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment. At the same time, Karl readied himself, checking his gauntlets and drawing his sword. He formed a quick plan. The hawk would strike from the side, not from behind, where Rita would expect it. Timing would be everything. With a silent command, Karl moved. He swung his blade forward, activating rend mid-strike. A crescent of energy surged toward Rita, but she blocked it effortlessly with one of the daggers that appeared in her hands. Before he could react, she had already shifted position, avoiding the hawk's dive and deflecting its attack as well. The gap in experience was immediately obvious. Still, Karl pressed forward. He followed up with another attack, combining his movements with the hawk's relentless strikes. Rita countered smoothly, her movements precise and controlled. Then, suddenly, she advanced. Her speed caught Karl off guard. He instinctively sidestepped and swung his sword, relying on reach to compensate for his lack of technique. Rita parried with ease, but that brief distraction created an opening. From above, the hawk struck again, landing a clean hit on the back of her neck. The impact left a visible mark. For a moment, Karl felt a surge of excitement. His strategy had worked, but the hawk's reaction was far less composed. It panicked, confused that such a precise strike hadn't ended the fight. In its mind, attacks like that should have been lethal. Karl quickly reassured it. Rita wasn't an ordinary opponent. She was far stronger than both of them. This wasn't a real battle. It was a lesson. The fight resumed with greater intensity. Rita turned to face both of them, keeping the hawk in her field of vision while launching a rapid series of attacks at Karl. He struggled to keep up, barely managing to block with his gauntlets. Within seconds, he was overwhelmed and knocked to the ground. From there, Rita demonstrated complete control. She neutralized the Hawk's follow-up attacks while maintaining pressure on Karl, showing him exactly how vulnerable he was. The difference in skill wasn't just noticeable, it was absolute. When she finally stopped, her evaluation was immediate and precise. Karl's Hawk was a powerful asset, capable of delivering fast, accurate strikes that would overwhelm most opponents at his level. But Karl himself was the weak point. Without proper combat skills, he would be forced to face enemies head-on while relying on his companion for support. Until he either gained another beast or fought alongside allies, he would always be at a disadvantage. The realization hit hard. Karl understood that despite his unique abilities, he was still essentially a warrior, one who needed to survive direct combat. His dream of becoming a powerful elite suddenly felt much heavier. It wasn't just about having abilities, it was about mastering them, and that required discipline far beyond what he had imagined. When Rita asked what he wanted to train first, Karl half expected something exciting: sword techniques, advanced combat skills, or even secret martial arts. Instead, she gave him the truth. They would start with physical conditioning. Karl couldn't help but feel a sinking sense of inevitability. He had hoped to avoid this, but deep down, he already knew the answer. The serum had accelerated his body's development, pushing him into a rapid growth phase. To keep up with his abilities, and especially with the speed of his Hawk, his body needed to catch up. Rita explained that he was currently at a common physique, but with proper training, he could reach awakened physique relatively quickly. Only then would he be able to fight at a level that matched his potential. The implication was clear. Without strengthening his body, his skills would never reach their full effectiveness. Karl sighed internally, already picturing what lay ahead. Running, drills, endless repetition. Rita led him toward the gym, where other agility-focused fighters were already training. She outlined the plan: establish a baseline, build endurance, and steadily improve until he met the minimum awakened standard. Ideally, this would take about a month, though the official evaluation would come at the end of the semester. Karl asked whether that timeline was typical. Rita's response shattered any lingering illusions. Many students would reach that level within weeks. True prodigies would push even further, approaching ascended rank within their first semester and achieving it shortly after. In that moment, Karl's vision of an easy, comfortable elite life disappeared completely. That's all for this video. We'll be back again with another one soon, so drop a like and do subscribe if you enjoyed it and want more of the same. Sergeant Rita took Karl to the gym, where he changed into an academy training uniform before joining the agility-type warriors, a class made up almost entirely of women. Watching the senior strength-type warriors training nearby, all bulky and muscular, made Karl feel out of place with his current physique. Rita explained his skill put heavy strain on his body, so he needed upper body strength to power through it without sacrificing the mobility he'd need to evade attacks. What followed was 2 brutal hours of training that left Karl utterly wrecked. Hawk fed him a piece of cold roast chicken from its stash to keep him going. Back at the cafeteria afterward, Karl looked rough, but still better off than most of the other students, trickling in bruised, burned, or soaked in strange liquids. He talked with a mage who'd spent the day casting lightning bolt 30 times until it stopped misfiring on him and everyone nearby, and another mage covered in scorch marks. They were stunned to hear he'd gotten a full 2-hour fitness session, far more than the standard 30 minutes warriors usually got, taking it as a sign Rita saw real potential in him. The mages complained about needing to hit awakened level mana before the semester exams, a target that required meditation they were too sore to manage. One student pointed out a girl nearby coated in slime, a water mage whose first spell, Refreshing Water Slime, let her passively recover stamina and mana just by wearing it, making her training nearly effortless. Hawk, unimpressed, only cared that slimes weren't edible. Exhausted, Karl collapsed into bed and woke the next morning to Sergeant Rita already at his door with breakfast, telling him they'd eat and study together in the gazebo. There, she began testing him with objects. An inert, plain rock got no reaction from him, but an ancient golden coin, blessed at the Dragon God Shrine during the last Dragon Festival, triggered an immediate surge of power and affinity when he touched it. Rita concluded that Karl's abilities resonated specifically with dragon energy. Intrigued, she pulled out a small vial of shimmering red liquid to test next, while Hawk telepathically begged Karl to get the evil lady to hand it over instead, unaware, fortunately, that Rita couldn't hear it. Rita explained that the red liquid was mana-infused monster blood, a common grade resource for physical cultivation elites. For humans, it was often fatal without a proper method to guide the process, but for a monster or magical beast, it should be safe. She asked Karl to summon Hawk so the Academy could observe the effect, revealing that leadership had already decided against training Karl as a frontline fighter with just Rend. Instead, senior professors wanted to build up Hawk into the primary combat unit, with Karl serving as its backup and leader in a support or scouting role, part of a broader strategy to push mages and beast-bonded elites into fighting alongside golems, summons, and monsters to reduce casualties. Hawk lapped up the blood eagerly, radiating power far beyond what a common-grade beast should produce. Within seconds, it grew noticeably larger, no longer swallow-sized, and much closer to fully grown, awakened-level strength. Karl then felt energy flow from Hawk back into him, sharpening his mind, his eyesight, and his physical strength, an effect he was certain came from Hawk's growth rather than his own ongoing changes from the serum. Karl asked whether there was a known method to help them grow faster. Rita explained that dragon-type energy, which Karl resonated with, was scarce, but carnivorous magical beasts like Hawk grew stronger by killing and absorbing the life force of other beasts. She suggested moving them into practical combat courses as soon as they finished basic skills and survival training, though the Academy couldn't risk sending them out unprepared since a student dying during training would cause public backlash. She noted that the mana injections were sold to the public as the promise of safety from monster invasions and war. Karl privately doubted most students would ever see real combat, since conventional weapons like artillery still outclassed most personal skills, though he acknowledged some abilities and powerful magical beasts capable of stopping bullets or slicing through armored vehicles could change that equation. He was already pursuing that path through Rend, reasoning that pushing the skill from awakened into ascended level could eventually let him tear through an armored vehicle himself. For now, though, he pointed out that the nation wasn't at war and the magical beasts were being held at bay. Rita insisted he still needed to maximize his combat training regardless and promised to push for better resources to accelerate Hawk's growth, warning that simply feeding it meat wouldn't be enough if they wanted forced growth. It would take a real plan. Karl considered the numbers. A Windspeed Hawk reached full growth at 4 months old, but even then it would only be a low, awakened-level beast with a common-grade physique. Without a clear plan or reference point, he risked being stuck at a low power level well into his second year. Rita brought Karl a stack of monster reference books, all written from a hunter's perspective, and gave him homework: compile a care and feeding guide for Hawk, backed by real research from the texts. If it held up logically, she promised more resources, at minimum, more of the mana-infused monster blood the Academy stocked for warrior classes needing quick physical boosts. Karl used his mental link with Hawk as a shortcut, simply asking what would help it grow stronger. Hawk requested meat, more of the red juice, and some blue fruits it had spotted. Checking his balcony greenhouse notebook, Karl found they were mountain gooseberries, treats with no real nutritional value that carried high mana content and doubled as monster bait. Though even concentrated, they were weaker than a real mana potion. He let Hawk have 3 a day, worried about overindulgence, and Hawk immediately used them as seasoning on its raw meat rather than eating them alone, which Karl noted down as homework material. Quizzing the bird further, Karl learned Hawk called Rita the evil woman simply because she always demanded work without offering food, and that Hawk's favorite resting spot was the branches of a tea tree, since the smell masked its scent from prey. Karl spent the afternoon compiling these answers into his report, then moved on to the textbooks, looking for supplements that might help beasts or Rend-type skills specifically. Research on magical beasts was thin, but Rend was a common warrior skill taught at the Academy, so supplement research for warriors was more developed. Unsure if human warrior supplements would work on Hawk, Karl checked the alchemy text for ingredient breakdowns instead. He found a strength potion made from monster blood infused with magically charged gemstone dust, which gave humans a long burst of energy, useless for Hawk directly, but the gemstone itself radiated power that might accelerate its growth. He also found a wind magic stone, a mana storage device crafted by mages rather than a natural resource, which Karl hoped would suit Hawk given its affinity for air magic and mana absorption. That gave him 4 potential growth resources: high-energy monster meat seasoned with gooseberries, the mana-infused monster blood, the strength stone, and the wind stone. Karl calculated that if he could secure all four, he might be able to push Hawk to full awakened strength within just a few weeks. Rita returned the next morning to collect Karl's homework, then came back with a bag of resources to test whether they could accelerate a tamed beast's growth beyond the normal pace, since a Windspeed Hawk would need a full semester to reach awakened rank naturally. Inside were 2 strength stones, a full liter of infused monster blood, and 6 wind stones radiating intense power, personally crafted by the headmaster, an overlord grade mage from the first successful batch of injected elites, who offered to make more if they proved effective. Karl dissolved a strength stone into a dish of monster blood, letting Hawk drink it down entirely, then turned to the wind stones, each no bigger than a ring diamond. Before Karl could decide how to use them properly, Hawk simply ate one outright. Winds tore through the balcony as raw power surged from Hawk into Karl through their bond, though outwardly Rita saw nothing but Karl sitting still. An hour later, Hawk emerged, transformed, nearly full-grown, forearm length, and radiating an awakened grade aura, having jumped from fledgling to young adult in hours. Rita confirmed this proved tamed monsters could be deliberately cultivated and began recording data. Karl reported feeling stronger himself, though he had no way to measure his own mana without a mage's help. Testing his gauntlets, he found rend now took almost no effort. 4 thick arcs slicing cleanly through the air, at what Rita judged to be awakened rank power. But stamina mattered for classification. 3 more full power casts left him panting, so after a short recovery, he switched to half-strength strikes instead, managing about a dozen more with barely any drain, feeling like he could keep going for hours. Rita clocked him at 15 minutes of sustained half output, still common grade, but on the strong end of it, and noted that his output was scaling directly with Hawk's growth. She told him that once Hawk grew stronger, he'd likely reach awakened level as a beast tamer riding on his beast's strength. Karl, energized by the results, floated the idea that with a month more of resources, they might be strong enough to spar with second years by exam time. Rita laughed it off as ambitious, warning that he'd still get wrecked without keeping up his combat training alongside Hawk's growth. Hawk snuck off with a second windstone while no one was watching, but this time the energy absorbed slowly instead of triggering an instant breakthrough. Rita speculated the stone might be too high-level a resource to safely rush a second time, risking harm to Hawk's body if forced. Karl agreed to ration the stones going forward, letting Hawk absorb each one fully before offering another. Hawk immediately crashed into a food coma and retreated to the mental space to sleep it off. Rita approved of the diet plan overall and confirmed the infused blood and a new strength stone would keep coming regularly, though the wind stones would take weeks to replace. She noted Karl's growth was fast, but resource-intensive, and that even wild magical beasts needed rare materials or strange energies to reach higher ranks, not just food. Karl reflected that raw growth alone wouldn't be enough. If they ever faced beast packs or invasions, one strong monster against 10 enemies would still lose. So, Hawk needed to actually outfight opponents at its level, not just get bigger. Hawk, initially dismissive of the idea that any Hawk could rival it, agreed to try using rend in new ways after watching other creatures fight, mostly to make Karl happy. Karl suggested visiting the training grounds to observe real combat for ideas, since Hawk wasn't coming out again for a while anyway. Rita took him to a field where second-year students trained unarmed combat, then redirected him toward defensive basics instead, having him learn to deflect incoming attacks with his claws rather than just striking. She led him to a bunker where common class mages near an awakened breakthrough were training, explaining that deflecting takes less effort than casting, and that Karl's presence would double as real-world defense practice for the mages, who initially resented the interruption before Rita explained the mutual benefit. Karl faced a dozen mages, firing spells down the hall toward a target, and worked to intercept and deflect their shots using low-output rend strikes. He found that elemental type mattered heavily. Fire and water spells passed through with only reduced power, while ice, earth, and solid projectiles were easy to knock off course. When he tried consolidating into single powerful strikes to save mana, the energy cost scaled brutally, teaching him it was far more efficient to use many small deflections than one large one. Exhausted but improving, Karl kept at it while the mages, realizing he wasn't some prodigy sent to show them up, but a fellow newbie grinding through mana control, just like they had, started to warm up to the exercise. The training sessions settled into a rhythm of constant breaks, with Karl still swatting at weak or slow attacks even during downtime, turning the exercise into an informal game with the mages. The supervising teacher, the sole instructor assigned to the dozen mages, privately judged it the best motivation he'd seen from them in months and noted that Karl was likely to surpass Sergeant Rita's own combat power by the end of his first semester, despite her having taken 3 years to reach mid-ascended rank herself. He recognized her as a naturally gifted teacher, even outside her own specialty. At lunch, Molly, a tall blonde mage, invited Karl to join them, remarking that his ranged claw attack was unusually strong for a starting warrior. Unnoticed by the group, Karl fed Hawk an entire plate of raw meat drizzled with mana-infused monster blood, making it vanish invisibly into his beast space. The mages spent the meal brainstorming ways to beat his defenses, firing double bolts, staggering shots apart, or varying their speed to make timing harder to predict. Karl learned this cafeteria was specific to the mage district, mana-rich compared to the muscle-building food in the warrior cafeteria, with a third mixed cafeteria serving non-combat students who studied in the dorms. Molly introduced herself, revealing she'd been born Gertrude Dingwall but had changed her name on her ID card the moment she arrived, since students could write down any name and the guards would honor it. Rita arrived to collect Karl for the afternoon, reminding the group that despite his ranged magic, the academy still classified him as a warrior, meaning he had actual combat training ahead on top of his morning casting practice. The mages teased him with mock prayers for his survival as they left for theory classes, already scheming new ways to slip past his defenses. Walking to the next session, Rita reassured Karl that the first-year unarmed combat class wouldn't be too rough, since most of the other new students had little real skill and his physique already outclassed them. She also handed him a new resource scavenged from a mage instructor, a memory drop, a minor focusing spell that made memorization easier, normally given to mages as a reward for strong test performance. Rita brought Karl to a small but muscular martial arts instructor, too old to have ever been chosen as an elite, but clearly a genuine hand-to-hand expert, well-suited to training raw recruits. She introduced Karl as an agility-type warrior with a versatile ranged claw attack from his gauntlets, well-suited to unarmed combat training too. The instructor had Karl set his gauntlets aside for a sparring assessment, wanting to see his instincts before shaping his training. Despite Hawk's unhelpful suggestion to swoop down and break the man's neck, Karl squared up with the basic stance Rita had taught him. The instructor proved deceptively agile, sidestepping Karl's counters and catching him with a knee to the midsection. Karl tried a sweep, missed the range, then attempted a low tackle that backfired completely, getting thrown onto his back hard enough to knock the wind out of him. He recovered and got back to his feet, regardless. The instructor decided Karl fit best with the mixed martial arts group rather than pure stand-up fighters, better suited for messy fights against monsters than soldiers. He explained that Karl's speed and power meant a punch could stun many common-grade monsters, and grappling skills could help him control a beast's claws if his ranged attacks failed to stop at first, not as an offensive tool, but as a defensive fallback. Rita was pulled in to help demonstrate the style's basics for the class, since none of the new students could match Karl as a sparring partner without it turning into bullying. By dinner, Karl was wrecked again, but the memory drop was already proving its worth, letting him recall all 50 techniques shown that day in perfect clarity, even if his body would need weeks of repetition to catch up. Eating with classmates from the unarmed combat group, he was needled about landing a personal trainer so early, and explained it was only because his unclassifiable marking left the academy with no idea how to train him. The other students, mostly grapplers and monks, who'd awakened their basic skills simply by throwing a punch, joked about their situation, extra stamina, and easy awakenings, but grueling training ahead, while one lamented that talking magic theory all day like the mages sounded far easier than getting beaten up daily. His friends were unconvinced he'd fare any better as a mage, or as a lover for that matter. That night, Hawk finished absorbing the second Windstone. Unlike the first, which had triggered a dramatic breakthrough to awakened level, this one produced only steady mana growth, pulling Karl along with it until just before dawn, when a surge of magic hit Karl and announced Hawk had gained a new skill, Windshield, unavailable to Karl himself for now, but a rare ability for a Windspeed Hawk to comprehend. Karl's excitement kept him up for hours before he barely managed to sleep before his alarm. The next morning, still recovering fast thanks to his growing appetite, Karl realized his uniforms no longer fit. His clothes were a size too small, and he couldn't even fasten his shoes shoes properly. He went to the laundry room, where a large woman in a raincoat outfitted him with new uniforms, boots, shoes, and even sandals in case his growth kept accelerating, telling him to bring back his old gear once he'd stabilized. Before heading to train with the mages, Karl asked Hawk which skill was more mana efficient, Rend or Windshield. Hawk favored Rend, but noted Windshield was useful against large attacks, and, specifically, water balls, which it seemed to hold a grudge against. Sensing Hawk was restless from being cooped up, Karl invited it to ride on his shoulder for the day's training, instead of staying in the mental space. Rita approved, and the mages were thrilled to have a real magical beast joining the session, curious how Hawk's threat assessment might differ from a human's. The barrage resumed with faster, staggered, and multicast attacks. Hawk immediately took to the air, circling to attack from above the way it preferred, and began specifically targeting the water mage's spells with wind, shield, splitting or dissipating their water balls, and even a fireball to the caster's confusion and irritation. When a fire mage responded, with 3 fireballs staggered in speed to dodge blocking, Hawk swept its foot and fired 3 simultaneous rending blades, intercepting all 3 at once to cheers from the watching mages, who marveled at how dangerous a bonded bird-type beast could be. At lunch after mage skills training, one of the mages, an older black-badged girl who might already be in her 3rd year, asked whether Karl would be allowed to join newbie wilderness training patrols, since teachers had apparently mentioned he might soon receive a black badge, letting him lead a group into the woods. Karl admitted he had no idea outings like that existed for first years, since the mages were his only real social contact outside solitary combat training. The group explained that mainly alchemists, druids, and garden witches needed outdoor fieldwork, while more bookish mages sometimes barely left the library at all. They encouraged Karl to go outside if he got the chance, both for good resources for Hawk and extra credit redeemable at the supply room. Rita arrived and shut the idea down immediately, insisting Karl still had a long way to go before wilderness trips, regardless of any badge. The mages teased that between Windshield and Rend, Hawk alone was tougher than most of them, with a whole Karl attached on top of that, but Rita wasn't budging. She ordered Karl to pack Hawk away and head to combat class, noting they'd be testing memory retention that day. Karl noted he could transfer Hawk back to the taming space remotely, though he wasn't sure of the range limit yet, another skill he'd need to test as their bond grew. At the training grounds, Rita waited with a group of older students already dressed down in the class's standard bare feet and shorts sparring outfit. Karl changed and returned shirtless, drawing a passing comment from one of the older students about his developing muscle. Rita explained the first drill, a sparring round, to test how much of the previous day's training had actually stuck, given the memory retention resource she'd provided. Paired against a boy slightly larger and more muscled, Karl used his smaller size to press close, avoiding the reach disadvantage he'd learned about from getting beaten by Rita the day before. His opponent proved fast, nearly Rita's speed, dodging rather than blocking, and using knee strikes to keep Karl at range whenever he tried to close the distance. Neither landed a clean hit over the full 3 minutes. Rita criticized both for the stalemate, and the boy complained good-naturedly that beating someone as short and fast as Karl was a job for the monk classes, not him. After 2 hours and a dozen sparring rounds, Rita called an end to the data gathering, satisfied that Karl showed solid memory and instinct despite never having actually won a fight. She explained the next phase wasn't about learning more techniques, but drilling everything he knew into instinct while training him to fight and coordinate with Hawk simultaneously, treating it like a mage forced to handle both offense and defense at once. The real goal was situational awareness. Karl couldn't let Hawk act purely on instinct, since enemies would learn to exploit that, so he'd need to guide his partner while still defending himself and staying combat ready. Rita laid out his new schedule: mage accuracy and speed drills in the morning, martial arts in the afternoon, and a full day of practical skills training weekly, replacing the elective day most students got. The day after would remain an off day for rest, before returning to the mage sessions the following Monday. Karl privately grumbled that being singled out for a customized program meant losing the lighter half-theory, half-practical schedule the other mages enjoyed, though he acknowledged that compared to second years, even their weakest members would likely still beat him. At the cafeteria that evening, Karl found it packed with freshmen he rarely interacted with, mostly non-combat track students still in theoretical training. They recognized him immediately as being from the group that had crossed crossed the entrance field first, which teachers were reportedly holding up as an example of proper courage and caution to the rest of the class. He learned that James and Kruger had become minor celebrities from the story, while Dana had buried herself in library training from day one, chasing a way to reduce her spellcasting costs so she could sustain magic through an entire fight instead of relying on short bursts, an approach one of the other students considered unrealistic given how burst damage-oriented most mage kits were. The group discussed the extra credit missions later in the year, usually done in larger groups led by a senior, and noted that Karl's personal tutor and customized curriculum already exempted him from needing the 2 rewards most students were chasing. Karl pointed out the downside. A full-time tutor also meant a schedule dictated entirely by someone else, with no room to slack off. The students laughed, agreeing that the teachers seemed to catch anyone coasting almost instantly, recalling the wave of extra homework everyone got in the first few days for treating the academy like ordinary school. The next morning, Karl reported to the training grounds as instructed, joined by a crowd of first years and several black-badged senior students. Rita handed him a bundled flag, explaining he'd serve as flag carrier and team leader for Team 5 in that day's exercise, filling in for Senior Jeffrey, who was away on a mission. One of the 2 overseeing mage instructors, an old natural mage rather than an injected elite, laid out the rules. Odd-numbered teams defended their flags with the flag carrier as leader, even-numbered teams attacked under a senior's command, and everyone would be grouped by randomly drawn tokens rather than choice, simulating the reality of emergency response, where you fight with whoever's available, not who you'd pick. Karl's random draw grouped him with Dana and 7 heavily armored boys carrying shields, hammers, and spears, drawing groans from other students about Team 5, stacking every defender in the class. Other teams ended up similarly lopsided. Team 3 got mostly mages with only light melee support, and Team 4 drew 8 mage girls, leaving Dana and 1 other warrior as the only girls not on that team. The old mage noted Team 5's setup traded mobility and defense for near unbreakable defense, meaning attackers would need to get creative to take their flag. With 2 minutes to prepare, Karl draped the black and gold academy flag over his shoulders as a cape and started assessing his team's skills. Dana revealed she could cast fog or magic missiles, though missiles drained her mana fast. The 7 warriors all shared the same 2 common skills, slash and guard, with guard covering roughly a 3-meter octagonal barrier, enough to absorb a couple of spells before breaking, but a serious weak point if enemy leaders focused fire on any one of them. Karl laid out a formation plan, overlapping shield walls in a turtle formation, staying tightly grouped to stay hard to spot, saving guard only for emergencies, and reserving Dana's fog until they were actually under attack rather than revealing their position early, since the fog would take a full minute to spread 10 meters and only slow further after that. With Karl and Dana as the team's only offensive options, unless the enemy charged directly, the plan leaned entirely on defense and positioning. Before they could refine it further, the instructor called time and ordered everyone to prepare for transport. Team 5 was transported into a knee-deep swamp shrouded in mist. Karl had Dana start her fog spell, while the group crouched hidden near a stand of trees. He released Hawk to scout for attackers, spotting them by the absence of the black flag cloak, with strict instructions to stay unseen and return within 5 minutes. Dana was surprised to learn about the pet bird, and Karl clarified it was both a class skill and a living creature he didn't want harmed. The warriors quickly grasped the layered strategy. Hawk's scouting prevented ambushes, the fog obscured their exact position, and the swamp water made them hard to target while letting them strike first if needed. Karl refined it further, telling Dana to thicken the fog near the trees rather than the edges, so enemies targeting the visual center of the cloud would miss their actual position by several meters. The warriors pulled vines from the trees, careful not to damage the island itself, and draped them overhead as camouflage. The battlefield was large, a full square kilometer of swamp, scattered with noisy, common-grade monsters like bullfrogs and beetles that helped mask searching groups. A few minutes later, Hawk returned, reporting no one nearby. 2 other defender groups had converged close together, and everyone else in the area was heading toward that fight, 3 against 2, leaving Team 5 likely safe until it resolved. Karl relayed this and asked if there was any way to help Dana sustain the fog longer. She said it wasn't too draining, just tedious, and by the time anyone came looking, the cloud would be large enough that only a direct sweep line search would find them, which suited the close combat-heavy team fine, since ranged attackers wouldn't see the fight coming from a distance. Karl sent Hawk back up into the trees to rest while keeping watch, privately noting that the bird needed some kind of discipline training, since it exploited any gap in his instructions, following orders to the letter but taking full advantage of anything left unsaid, like napping right after a successful scouting run simply because napping hadn't been forbidden. He recognized the pattern. During mage training, constant, specific commands kept Hawk in line, but vague, open-ended orders let its natural instincts take over. Hawk soon reported the other battle nearly finished, with an experienced fighter having eliminated most of one side, leaving 4 young survivors moving south along the edge of the training zone, not yet heading toward Team 5, but clearly searching for something. Karl relayed the update, admitting he didn't yet know which 4 students they were, then proposed a new plan: keep expanding the fog from the same spot while the team physically relocated, letting the enemy search the fog cloud in vain and burn time before doubling back, since successfully defending the flag didn't require a fight at all, just outlasting the clock by frustrating the attackers. Watching from a crystal ball in a hut on the academy's edge, the old mage and Rita discussed Karl's tactics. The old mage worried Karl was avoiding real combat, but Rita corrected him. Karl understood his objective was purely to protect the flag until time ran out, not to defeat the attackers, and he was exploiting the fact that search teams wouldn't double back on ground they'd already cleared. The younger mage compared it to a past mission where they'd simply waited out a search team on a beach after retrieving a grimoire from the Thalian temple, prompting the old mage to reflect briefly on how magical societies had historically prioritized preserving rare species and hunting grounds over the broader human population, a history now smoothed over in the official records as mere allied failure rather than deliberate exclusion. In the swamp, Karl led his team south, staying hidden while Hawk tracked the 4 attackers, 2 ranged warrior leaders and 2 first-year mages, as they searched the fogged area and found no life larger than a bird. Believing the defenders had fled, the attackers pushed north first, giving Karl's group a window to stay put with 15 minutes left. But the attackers doubled back south with 10 minutes remaining, moving faster and more determined. Discovering disturbed routes at the original hiding spot, one leader deduced the defenders had shifted west, then south, and warned his team to search open ground beyond the fog rather than wading back into it. Wary of an ambush from a split formation, the attackers advanced directly toward Karl's real position, where the defenders lay hidden on dry ground rather than water this time. Karl gave Hawk instructions to strike with rend from above once the fight started, staying at a safe distance to avoid counterattacks, and told his team to rise into turtle formation on his signal, prioritizing the 2 leaders as the real threat, while leaving the more fragile mages for Hawk to handle. As the attackers came into view, Karl's team stood and formed a full defensive circle with raised shields, prompting one of the attackers to note the defenders seemed to have anticipated their approach. Unbeknownst to Karl, one of the attacking leaders had a burst-speed movement technique that would let him strike from unexpected angles, something Karl hadn't planned for. His full turtle formation had been set up as a general precaution against unknown mage tricks, not in response to any specific threat he was aware of. Both leaders launched their attack at once, sword light streaking forward as Karl's shield warriors raised guard barriers. Karl intercepted the swords with 2 rounds of rend, dissipating the first strike and stopping the second cold, while Hawk's simultaneous dive took out both attacking mages before they even registered the ambush, triggering their uniform's defensive charms and eliminating them instantly. The attackers scrambled, unaware where the threat had come from, since Hawk stayed hidden in the trees rather than exposing himself. That confusion bought Karl time for 2 more rend strikes, forcing the leaders into defense, right as Dana finished casting her slower but unusually powerful magic missiles. With their swords already out of position from parrying, the leaders took the hits directly, absorbing them with their enhanced bodies before dodging sideways, straight into a second wave of Hawk's claws that the defensive magic barely caught in time to save their backs. The match ended there, with the overseeing mage declaring victory for Team 5. The stunned attackers hadn't realized 2 sets of rending claws were in the air. and had jumped directly into the second. Karl called Hawk back from the training zone, only about a kilometer out, and marveled at the transport spell that had moved the whole match, an ancient artifact capable of relocating and magically protecting multiple students at once. Rita and the old mage praised the ambush as masterful, calling it a refreshing change from the usual straightforward swamp fights, and agreed that pairing scouting and ambush tactics with standard warrior mage teams had made for a much more dynamic match. Everyone on Team 5 got a bonus credited to their student cards. Walking back, Karl's teammates speculated about how the academy had known to build such a strong team around him from day one, concluding it had to be the Rending Claw skill itself, deadly enough to block 2 awakened rank leaders at once without exhausting him, made even more unfair by Hawk essentially doubling the same ability. Since the bonus wasn't shared or diluted among winners, having all 9 members qualify was a major windfall, and the group made plans to study together after cleaning up. Dana, curious about Karl's schedule since she'd never seen him in any magic theory classes, pressed him until he admitted he had no traditional lecture classes at all, just skill interception training, martial arts, and whatever ad hoc lessons Rita assigned, like monster anatomy. The group teased Dana in turn, revealing her own afternoon schedule was modern dance and cosmetology, a clear sign the academy was grooming her to be trained as an idol whether she wanted it or not. Karl noticed, seemingly for the first time, how genuinely cute she was, even covered in mud, chalking up his delayed awareness to the physical changes brought on by the serum. Dana grumbled about her idle track teachers living out their own failed dreams through the students, and Karl agreed to join the group in finding a study spot since he had a stack of books waiting on him. After showering and sending his ruined uniform off to the laundry, Karl met up with Dana at the study spot, learning their other 2 teammates had been pulled away by their combat instructor after impressing him with their guard skills. Dana explained her focus for the day was mana theory, the core discipline for mage classes that governed both mana pool growth and reducing spell casting costs. She noted that as mages improved, they'd naturally gain insight into new spells outside formal instruction, letting them expand their spellbook faster, with insight-gained spells tending to grow stronger and more useful for ranking up than ones simply taught in class. Karl contrasted his own situation. Without any known class precedent, he had no path to insight-based growth, just his single rend skill, though its power scaled directly with Hawk's growth, and his own physical strength scaled with both. Dana called it both a limitation and a huge advantage, since he grew stronger just by training his pet without heavy study, though she noted a single skill would eventually cap his versatility. Dana led him to a garden with private study gazebos, mentioning her plan to buy an academy laptop or tablet once she had enough credits, since the mage faculty still insisted on handwritten tomes, despite how much slower it was. Karl admitted he didn't know how to type at all, having grown up in the mining town without access to computers, unlike Dana, whose family ran a city clothing shop that relied on them for basic operations. The conversation touched briefly on how little of the nation's infrastructure investment had ever reached the mining town, despite its twin mines, one coal, one precious metal, being critical national assets that never benefited the people extracting them. Settling into a lilac-scented gazebo enclosed by enchanted hedges for privacy, the 2 set out their study materials. Karl pulled out his monster reference guide, the same one all field expedition students were required to memorize, which Rita had assigned him even though she had no plans to let him leave the academy grounds yet. Her real goal was for him to learn enough about monster abilities to plan his own growth path, which Karl assumed would eventually lead to her finding him a second, more durable companion beast to add to his collection. Karl found himself distracted studying alongside Dana, more by her presence and scent than by the monster reference material, though he kept his focus on his notes. He hoped that mastering the material would eventually convince Rita to let him leave the academy grounds, since he'd seen little of the wider world growing up in the mining town and was eager for the chance to explore it properly, even just as part of a training group. As sunset approached, Dana called an end to their session, noting the academy grounds went dark outside the lit pathways after nightfall. She mentioned enjoying studying with Karl specifically, since her usual teammates were too chatty and unserious to focus with. When they stepped out of the gazebo, the the world went abruptly and unnaturally dark, darker than the actual time of day warranted. Karl, able to see by the faint bioluminescent glow of the grass, realized someone had cast a darkness spell over the maze, rather than nightfall simply arriving early. He offered his hand to guide Dana through, and she gripped it tightly, visibly anxious, prompting Karl to wrap an arm around her shoulders as he led her safely out. Once they emerged into the fading evening light, a senior student stepped out from behind a tree, laughing and revealing that they'd just walked through the Maze of Romance, the Academy's well-known hidden makeout spot, where students periodically cast darkness spells for entertainment to see which couples emerged intact, which split up, or which took things further under cover of the dark. Dana blushed, and Karl, seizing the opportunity, suggested they lean into the reputation. If everyone assumed they came there to make out, no one would bother them while they actually studied. Dana caught his meaning after a beat, briefly flustered by the implication of the two of them alone in the Academy's most notorious couple spot, but agreed to the plan, suggesting they return after breakfast the next day, an off day, to study properly. Karl offered to pack lunch. As they left, ignoring an unrelated argument breaking out near the maze exit, neither noticed they were still holding hands until Dana turned toward her dorm and was pulled back by the grip. She apologized, flustered, and hurried off to her room for the night. Too excited to sleep, Karl was up early for their first official day off, only to find the common areas already packed, with students planning to explore the grounds together, threatening his quiet study plans with Dana. She joined him at breakfast, looking equally sleep-deprived. Drinking a bright green energy drink she assured him wasn't as dangerous as it looked, while Karl stuck with coffee. Realizing the garden would be too crowded and loud for real studying, Karl suggested his own room instead, specifically the isolated, soundproofed balcony patio, since her own room was constantly disrupted by combat practice from neighboring students. They left together, drawing envious looks and fueling gossip about whether they'd known each other before arriving at the academy, one of the few distractions students had in a routine stripped of any personal belongings from home, since the only real pre-academy instruction had been not to bring clothing. Dana grabbed her books before following Karl into his suite, visibly startled by the dark decor and padded leather bedframe, but her attention shifted entirely once Karl opened the curtains to reveal the balcony greenhouse. She immediately spotted a ripening moonberry tree, recognizing the fruit as a prized, brain-healthy delicacy she'd only seen served at upscale restaurants. Karl let her pick it to split as a snack, and they settled into the gazebo, the same style used in the maze, which she noted was clearly popular around campus. Karl explained the greenhouse itself had been passed down through generations of balcony suite residents, and that he simply maintained it, since most of the magical plants had practical uses. Dana marveled at how completely silent the space was, despite students visibly walking below, calling it a perfect study spot. Karl opened his tactics textbook, next in Rita's stack of assigned reading, and realized with mild embarrassment that this particular book would have been useful to read before his skirmish the previous day. It struck him that Rita had never set deadlines or given formal tests, leaving him to assume the actual training sessions themselves were the real assessments, and that he'd been slacking by not at least skimming ahead through the material she'd left him. Dana cut up the moonberry to share while they studied, each piece leaving them noticeably refreshed. Though with only about a dozen fruits on the tree, Karl figured one per off day was sustainable without depleting it. Bored by the tactics manual despite his sharpened focus, Karl switched to reading the greenhouse's journal instead, discovering the previous resident had been a witch skilled at brewing potions, teas, and tonics from the various plants, some requiring specific magical affinities he didn't have. Karl had no cooking background himself, having grown up with a kitchen too small for more than one person and meals mostly provided ready-made by school and the mine. Noticing Dana beginning to glow faintly with magical buildup, a sign she was on the verge of learning a third spell, Karl asked about her pace. She explained she had excellent memory and aptitude for absorbing new magic quickly, even though her raw power wasn't exceptional, having mastered her first spell before even leaving the train, and now nearing a third casting, or a slow fog channel. She contrasted herself with Gil, the class's strongest student, who could cast 5 magic arrows at once but struggled to control their direction and stability. Karl connected this to the cook and guard's earlier comments about uneven aptitude among awakened elites, and noted that Dana's idle track training made sense given her versatility rather than raw strength. Her dance instructor had said reaching upper awakened, ideally ascended, by graduation would be enough for that path. Turning the question back on Karl, Dana pressed him on what the academy was grooming him for with his dedicated tutor and custom schedule. He reasoned it was likely monster control work for the military or government, since his class didn't fit any standard combat or magic curriculum and his skill set was purely combat or scouting oriented. Dana suggested he could become more versatile by teaching Hawk additional skills or learning to use monster abilities directly himself, pointing out that Hawk had already picked up wind barrier on its own. She floated the idea that an ascended grade version of the greenhouse's cooling aloe plant, which at common grade only treated rashes, sunburn, and mild pain, could actually heal real wounds outright if properly cultivated, something she'd seen referenced on a nature program. Karl, unfamiliar with television or medicinal plant care beyond basic wilderness survival botany, considered whether it might be worth researching how to rank up the aloe, though the greenhouse guide indicated most of its plants were simply edible growth-boosting snacks rather than anything more specialized. Karl and Dana studied smoothly into the afternoon before hunger sent them to an early dinner. Dana asked if she could visit again after her own evening stamina and meditation training, and Karl readily agreed, glad to have found a friend at the academy and finding that hearing about mage progression kept sparking ideas for his own growth. Considering meditation as a technique, Karl wondered if it connected to expanding his beast space, recalling that the train car's crystal ball had once shown a view into that same space. He asked Hawk's opinion, who only cared that the space might eventually be bigger with trees and mice, though Karl ruled out live mice, worried it might accidentally bond him to a tortured earth mouse companion. Back in the greenhouse hammock, Karl tried meditating while visualizing a pine tree for Hawk, with nothing happening at first. He then tried channeling energy into the space the way he would for casting rend, and after an hour, Hawk reported the space felt better, encouraging him to keep going. By the second hour, a small pine sprig had physically sprouted near Hawk's nest, and by night's end it had grown nearly as tall as Karl himself, leaving him feeling refreshed and subtly empowered. Returning to Mage Skill Control class Monday, everyone looked recovered from the weekend. The instructor introduced an added defender for the day, Tori, an 18-year-old graduating Ascended Rank Mage with a bronze badge whose arrival visibly soured the mood among the students. Once the exercise began, Tori summoned a growing ring of small blue orbs that intercepted attacks with automatic bolts, nullifying weaker spells and knocking solid or magic missile attacks off course. Though fire and water spells passed through mostly unaffected, Karl relied on Hawk and Rend to cover those gaps, noting Rend destabilized attacks effectively even at low power, letting him conserve energy while using supervision to fine-tune his timing. After forming a dozen orbs, Tori stopped expanding the spell to focus on sustaining it, leaving roughly 3/4 of the class's attacks intercepted between her and Karl's pair. Hawk, in particular, was making the water mages look foolish, until one of them, out of sheer frustration, spontaneously mastered a new spell entirely on his own, splitting his water bullet into a spray of raindrops that got 1/3 of its mass past Ren's defense, like buckshot. Combat training followed the mage session, leaving Karl thoroughly exhausted by mid-afternoon. He complained to Rita about the pace, but she insisted the intensity would pay off, that pushing hard early would speed up his body's adaptation to the schedule rather than prolong the suffering. Karl privately suspected the training would just keep scaling with his growth, meaning he'd never actually catch up to feeling adapted. He mentioned meditation was helping settle Hawk's mental space, prompting Rita to jot it down for his training records, likely locking it into his official routine going forward. At dinner, Karl noticed his usual pasta special hit differently, delivering a jolt of energy far beyond what he remembered from the same dish. Rather than burn it off with exercise, he chose to meditate and channel the surplus directly into Hawk's mental space, reasoning that since Hawk was his main source of growth, feeding that connection was the better investment. He reflected that without the lucky discovery of bonding through the egg, he'd never have guessed his class required literally connecting with monsters, and the academy would never have risked giving an untested student that kind of access anyway. Settling into the hammock, Karl found the extra energy transferred into the taming space quickly, leaving him hungry again within the hour, while the pine tree there had grown further, now accompanied by patches of grass. Unsure what had changed about the food, he returned to the kitchen to ask if the recipe had shifted. The kitchen worker confirmed nothing had changed on their end, same batch as the week before, but suggested his own body might simply be developing new taste and energy compatibility as his abilities advanced, comparing it to how Berserker class students craved increasingly spicy food as they grew stronger. She offered him samples of the day's specials to test, and Karl worked through a plate of everything, finding each dish delivered the same unusually potent energy boost. He settled on the pasta and meatloaf as the most effective for his training, arranged for extra portions that evening, and planned to return early the next morning for a heavier breakfast to keep the momentum going. Karl brought the cart of food into his room, thanking the staff and promising to leave the dishes in the hall for pickup the next morning. Settling into meditation, he continued channeling excess energy into the taming space, watching the tree grow and the grass patch slowly expand, before eating the pasta and meatloaf specials in turn and pouring their energy in as well. After transferring both meals, he hit a clear ceiling of resistance, a reassuring sign the space had limits rather than being an endless sink, though at the current growth rate, filling it with grass alone would take months, let alone a full sky and environment. With the space temporarily full, Karl tried funneling his remaining energy directly into Hawk instead. The bird happily absorbed it, though Karl couldn't detect any measurable effect beyond a contented Hawk, which he decided was worthwhile regardless. He kept this up through the night as Hawk finished its growth phase, shifting from getting bigger to simply getting stronger. By breakfast, Karl finished the last 2 meals to keep feeding Hawk's continued hunger for both meat and the filtered energy, alongside its daily berry allowance, prompting him to loosen his earlier restriction on gooseberries now that Hawk was fully grown. That gave him an idea. Instead of rationing berries directly, he could crush them into a water marinade for the meat, coating it evenly like his mother used to do with cheap cuts at home, stretching the berries further while still satisfying Hawk's taste for them. When Rita arrived and noticed the stack of empty dishes, Karl explained his sudden spike in appetite the day before. She identified it as a normal sign of a warrior's body advancing a rank, guessing either Karl or Hawk had broken through to awakened rank overnight, with the energy demand pulling from Karl's own reserves. Karl, reported Hawk, now looked fully grown, having settled after another growth spurt overnight. When he called the bird out, Rita examined it closely, noting the softer juvenile feathers were gone, replaced by larger, sturdier pin feathers. She praised the result as remarkable, calling 1 week to bring a Windspeed Hawk to full maturity, a top-tier achievement for the Academy, regardless of any other combat applications his class might offer. Karl asked whether Hawk's success meant more resources, since even fully mature, its growth was now slowing without extra help. Rita laughed off his ambition, but agreed that continued energy feeding could push Hawk from awakened toward ascended rank in a relatively short window, promising to secure whatever resources she could, though she wasn't sure what would still be effective after the Strength Stone and Wind Stones. Karl suggested an upgraded Strength Stone or more potent infused blood, unsure if more wind-type resources would help further since the first stone had already caused a major breakthrough, and the second was still being digested slowly. He noted that since his own body scaled directly with Hawk's growth, funneling resources into Hawk remained the most efficient path forward, a plan Hawk fully endorsed given the obvious personal benefit. Back at training, a now fully mature Hawk relished the chance to outshine the mages further, blocking even more of their attacks purely to bask in their frustration and grudging respect, less concerned with actually protecting the target than with reinforcing its own dominance. The mages joked that Hawk seemed to be needling them deliberately, especially the water-type casters it clearly held a grudge against, unaware that Hawk genuinely viewed itself as superior to humans in general, flightless, poor-sighted creatures that didn't even hunt their own food, conveniently ignoring that it didn't either these days. While Karl trained martial arts that afternoon, Hawk took to circling the sky, hoping to finally hunt something on Academy grounds, but found the wards and constant magical activity had long since driven off any wildlife. Restricted to staying within Karl's sight and unable to venture into the surrounding fields, Hawk settled for exploring instead, finding a shady tree, a building carving that resembled itself, an old woman who kept photographing it, and a set of truck docks it suspected were full of good things worth investigating later. Karl mostly let Hawk roam, occasionally reminding it not to cause trouble or accept food from strangers who might not recognize it as a tamed companion. Rita handed over another study assignment, this time on monster biology, hoping it might reveal further ways to sustain Hawk's accelerated growth. She reflected that her role as his private instructor was ultimately about proving out the potential the senior staff had spotted in Karl back on the train, and that even if his rapid early growth eventually plateaued, his case would still give the Academy a valuable baseline for training the next student who awakened a similarly unclassifiable ability. Karl worked through his textbooks trying to find a reliable way to push Hawk from awakened to ascended without a long plateau, reasoning that progression came down to Ren's skill refinement and raw power growth, both aided by the infused blood and their unusually intense daily training compared to a wild Hawk's occasional hunting. Since Hawk had already learned Wind Barrier from the headmaster's Windstones, Karl knew mystic resources could grant new abilities outright. He just needed access to more of them. Dana interrupted with a visit, bringing Hawk a farmland delicacy, a skinned iron-jaw mole, a pest known for strong jaws but no ranged attack, and even weaker than the earth mice outside the academy. Hawk tore into it eagerly on the patio while Dana explained her own current focus: mana control. Her instructors had restricted her to just magic missiles and fog until she improved her casting efficiency, since her spells still burned more mana than necessary and were holding back her progress toward multiple castings. Karl noted the parallel to his own problem, needing a way to keep pushing Hawk's growth now that it was nearing its natural ceiling from food and resources alone, with the real test being whether they could bridge awakened to ascended before the semester ended. After finishing its meal, Hawk fetched a ripe pear from the trees, a plant known for relieving stress, but rejected it as too sweet for its taste, leaving it for the humans. Then, seeking attention, Hawk hopped onto Dana's notepad and demonstrated something instinctive, forming a rend blade and cycling its intensity from full power down to nearly nothing and back, prompting Karl to explain the underlying lesson that pushing a spell at full output wastes mana exponentially compared to holding and fine-tuning it at lower power. Skeptical at first, Dana tried the same technique with her magic missiles, nearly losing control at first before learning to hold and modulate them smoothly. She was floored by the realization, focusing on sustaining and shaping the mana flow rather than just firing and aiming opened up far more efficient casting than anything her teachers had shown her. Karl guessed the senior students already used this kind of control but assumed it was too advanced to teach beginners, and estimated that even at half power, she could likely cast 5 missiles for every one she managed before. Dana and Hawk spent the evening drilling skill control together while Karl dug into research on magical beast growth triggers, convinced there had to be identifiable patterns tied to skills, elemental alignment, or environment rather than pure randomness. He realized his edge over Hawk's natural growth came specifically from being able to redirect his own absorbed meal energy into Hawk instead of it going to waste, something ordinary elites couldn't replicate since they lacked a bonded beast to funnel it into. Karl learned that species showed distinct, trackable signs when crossing from awakened to ascended, since power rankings had no precise measurement and relied on these visible markers instead. Devil cats grew a second tail, many birds developed new feather patterns, and most mammals underwent sudden growth spurts. For Windspeed Hawks specifically, the tell would be their claws shifting from dull black to translucent obsidian, a material valuable enough to be ground up and mixed with monster blood like the strength stones. To boost skill comprehension in other elites who drank it, Hawk found the idea of profiting off its own shed claw clippings hilarious, likening it to human toenail clippings, while Karl teased that helping Hawk reach that level would let them show off just how far ahead it already was. Their routine settled into mornings with the mages, afternoons of martial arts, and evenings of study and skill work. Karl on beast growth research, Hawk and Dana on mana control. Progress accelerated fast. Hawk went from a handful of daily rend casts to sustaining the skill for hours by week's end, while Dana gained full control over her magic missiles, holding and steering them with her mind, still draining her faster than she'd like, but a massive leap from her starting point. At the next practical skills gathering, all 54 students assembled as usual, but But Rita arrived, driving a cargo buggy loaded with gear from the Golden Dragon National Research University's Weapons Development Department. She announced a field trip, leaving the academy grounds entirely, a higher-risk outing than usual, to test experimental equipment claimed to boost a user's power by a full rank. The mages were skeptical, assuming the tech was warrior-focused, since their own strength came from internal mana control rather than external tools. But when the tarp came off the cart, every student found a labeled box waiting with their name on it, sparking excitement across the group. Karl received his box from the stack Rita was organizing and had to figure out its fingerprint scanner locking mechanism, a piece of city tech unfamiliar to someone raised in a small mining town. Inside were new gauntlets resembling his current pair, but lighter, with claws made from actual monster material instead of alloy, plus an upper arm covering that hinted at hidden mana channeling or amplification properties. Testing them alone, Karl found casting rend felt more natural than even doing it barehanded, and while the power output seemed unchanged, his recovery felt noticeably faster, as if the gauntlets were returning some of the spent energy back to him, promising far less fatigue during his usual defensive drills with the mages. Once all the university-designed gear was distributed, chaos briefly swept the field as students tested swords, spells, and a golem all at once. Rita then announced a new twist. Students would be paired up by drawing matching numbered slips and sent to work independently across a large region with no backup. The mage devices varied in form, mostly belt-mounted crystal and tube frames, though one student's version was a wired hooded coat. Dana's box held a flatter, paperback-sized focusing device. Karl briefly wondered about disguising it under a book cover for practicality and asked Rita what the gauntlets were made from. She confirmed only that they combined various monster parts to blend magical beast traits into crafted items. Karl drew number 17 and worked his way through the organizing crowd to find his match, landing next to Dana, who held the matching card. Both were pleased, already familiar with each other's skills and confident in a natural division of roles. Karl leading, Hawk scouting, Dana providing backline damage. Dana explained her new tool was a focusing device meant to intensify her spellcasting, tricky to use at first, but promising a real boost to her output once mastered. With their team now set, the two turned to figuring out what challenge awaited them next. The mage's transport spell took visibly more effort this time, and Karl and Dana landed in a ruined warehouse, stocked with dry goods and a honey barrel swarming with bees. They moved quickly to avoid the bees, making their way out into a devastated village that Karl immediately identified as recently attacked, the smell of fresh blood and gunpowder still hanging in the air. Familiar to him from his mining childhood and sharpened further by Hawk's enhanced senses, Karl deduced the mission was to clear out whatever monsters had moved into the aftermath, and sent Hawk up to scout, coaching it to report enemy count, location, and power level precisely. Hawk reported 9 injured wild pigs nearby, 1 awakened and 6 non-awakened goblins farther south lazily building a campfire. Karl redirected Hawk's priorities, work before eating, and had it lead them toward the goblins first. Aware from his studies that goblins traveled in larger bands, meaning more were likely hiding nearby, he explained to Dana that the goblins' cunning and numbers, despite their weakness individually, probably explained how the village had fallen. As they moved through town, Hawk spotted 2 more goblins hiding in a house up the street. Karl kept walking normally rather than react, banking on the goblins' poor eyesight to assume they hadn't been seen, luring them into charging out for an ambush of their own. 2 of the 3 wounded goblins fell instantly to Hawk's rend before Karl or Dana could act, and Karl finished the last with a flick of his fingers. He sent Hawk back out immediately, worried the goblins' battle cry might have drawn attention from the rest of their band, while Dana admired Hawk's speed and reflexes. Karl pushed south with Dana, letting Hawk pick off stray goblins along the way, even as it complained about their stench and inedibility, holding out hope for the iron tusk boars it had spotted in the distance. With 5 wandering goblins already cleared, and the main pack of 6 still ahead, Karl let Dana take point on the attack, since her magic missiles cast slower than Rend, planning to cover her once the fight opened. Dana confirmed she could still only manage 2 missiles simultaneously, though follow-up volleys came faster once she started casting. Hawk confirmed the remaining goblin band was all common grade with no awakened leader, suggesting whichever elite responded first had already dealt with the real threat and left the stragglers. At the goblin camp, The pair caught the group unguarded around a fire pit. Dana opened with 2 magic missiles into the goblins nearest the flames, while Karl handled the rest, cutting down the closest and the fastest reactors as Dana finished off the last fleeing target. Karl moved in to confirm kills despite the overpowering stench of the camp, a grim reminder that the goblins had been feeding on slaughtered villagers, giving each body a precautionary stab before returning to Dana. Hawk's aerial sweep confirmed no remaining threats anywhere in town, no other monsters, no survivors in the houses, leaving Karl and Dana confused about the light guidance they'd received for the mission, but ready to move on to the wild boars before lunch. At the town dump, they found the iron-tusked boars rooting through garbage, led by a newly awakened boar that Dana sensed carried some kind of magic before Karl could tell. They coordinated a full ambush. Dana took a sniping position atop a stone shed. Hawk targeted the awakened boar directly on her cue, and Karl handled the remaining boars as they charged. Dana's magic missiles combined with 6 rend strikes brought down the lead boar as it tried to block with its tusks, while Karl's attacks penetrated the toughened hides of the others despite their near-awakened strength. Hawk mopped up the charging stragglers, and Dana finished the last, a greedy boar too distracted eating to flee. The fight ended quickly, prompting Dana to remark it had been anticlimactic, though Karl cautioned against jinxing it since they were still far from the academy. He then pulled out a reference textbook and began butchering the boars for Hawk, and to Dana's surprise, each carcass simply vanished the moment he finished with it, transferred straight into his taming space. Dana was startled watching the boar carcasses vanish, and Karl explained the mechanic behind his beast space storage. Food went in and out freely without spoiling, but nothing else, not even his own textbooks, worked the same way. Dana suggested testing the space's limits with something Hawk specifically couldn't use, floating the idea that the storage might be tied to what actually benefited the pet rather than food in general, an idea Karl latched onto as a potential new research angle for accelerating Hawk's growth. With no sign of anyone arriving to collect them, despite the mission's usual 1-hour window, Karl decided to just have lunch on site rather than risk searching the ransacked houses for supplies. He grilled sliced pork over branch skewers while Dana practiced her still unmastered fire spell, taking 3 tries to get a flame going. They floated the possibility that this was secretly an overnight survival test, given the timing lined up with the coming rest day, and agreed that if no one came by dinner, they'd need to scavenge for supplies and avoid sheltering directly in the ruined town, since it would likely attract more monsters hunting for food. After eating, Hawk swept the town twice more, finding no survivors, no other monsters, surprisingly few bodies despite heavy bloodstains in several houses. Karl reasoned they shouldn't have been left unsupervised in the field this long as still common grade students, and guessed someone was originally meant to meet them there, but had likely been driven off or killed in the goblin attack before their arrival, leaving no one to report their mission complete. Dana suggested searching for a working phone or landline to reach the academy directly. The two headed back toward the town square, with Hawk scouting overhead, unsettled by the town's total silence. No birds, no rodents, nothing moving. Those scattered lights still burned, confirming the place hadn't been fully destroyed, just emptied. This time, instead of watching for threats, Karl scanned the square for any sign of a message or contact left specifically for them. The town square showed no sign of a battle, suggesting the attack hadn't happened there, so Karl checked a nearby stone government building and found it similarly undisturbed inside, indicating the assault had likely struck at night while most residents slept, catching the perimeter unprepared. The building's computers still had power, and Dana, familiar with the outdated operating system from school, found a text file left on the desktop, a notice from Mayor Dingwall explaining the village had evacuated to designated Safe Point Alpha after a surprise goblin attack, with plans to return within 30 days once the elites cleared the area, warning of continued invasion risk. The message was dated that same morning, meaning it had been posted around when Karl and Dana were still in their briefing, though much of the blood they'd seen looked older. Dana pointed out that the handful of goblins they'd already cleared didn't match the scale of an ongoing threat, concluding the real attack was likely still coming that night. Karl agreed, reasoning from his monster biology reading that goblins avoided daylight, giving them roughly 7 hours to prepare before a larger tribe arrived after dusk to scavenge. They settled on using the solid stone government building as their base, but rather than passively waiting inside, Karl proposed actively hunting goblins through the night with Dana's help. Since Dana couldn't see in the dark and wasn't suited for close combat, Karl suggested she blanket the town in a low-lying fog bank, thick enough near the ground to blind the goblins, but shallow enough that Hawk, attacking from above, could still see clearly. This would let them isolate and ambush the raiders in small groups instead of facing a coordinated force, since screams and chaos wouldn't carry through the fog to alert the rest. Dana agreed to start weaving the fog immediately, and the pair also planned for torches and lanterns in case the power failed during the fight. Karl volunteered to scavenge oil and rags from a nearby auto shop to fashion improvised torches, along with searching for an oil lantern, a tool familiar to him from his mining background. Karl slipped into the mechanic's shop down the block, finding it untouched despite the rest of the town's ransacking. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry. Inside, he grabbed a cigarette lighter and, more importantly, a full drum of grease on a dolly, perfect, slow-burning fuel for torches. In the front office, he discovered bags of herbs soaked in fuel, giving off a strong, unpleasant odor, possibly the reason the shop had been left alone, and took 2 spare bags along with fuel to activate them. He also raided the unlocked vending machine for snacks and grabbed metal cargo bars from the parts department to use as torch handles, along with a length of chain, before calling out to check for survivors and getting only silence in response. Back at the government building, Dana's fog had already swallowed most of a city block and was spreading further. Karl reported his haul: snacks, torch materials, and the scent-masking herb bags, confident they'd work given how thoroughly they'd protected the shop. Dana warned that once she finished the fog, she'd need to rest, leaving Karl and Hawk's warning system to cover the watch, and reminded him to set the herb bags in place immediately, since masking their scent would be useless if left too late. They placed the pungent bags in the lobby, irritating Dana's nose, but hopefully keeping monsters away from their resting spot, while Hawk retreated into the beast space to conserve energy for the night hunt ahead, since Windspeed Hawks had a natural sense for dusk transitions when nocturnal prey grew active but sluggish. Dana woke them both around 6 that evening, an hour before sunset, to report the fog now extended past the town's edge. She turned in to rest while Karl and Hawk took over watch duty, with Karl sending Hawk up to scan the sky and report any movement approaching the town. Hawk scouted a wide loop around the town and spotted the incoming threat, a large group of goblins breaking camp and heading their way. Karl told Hawk to keep tracking them without engaging yet, wary of something stronger than common grade hiding among them. With roughly an hour before the goblins arrived, Karl considered contacting the academy to confirm the empty town was actually part of the plan, but doubted the number would be easy to find given how restricted elite communications likely were. As the goblins closed in, Hawk reported they were splitting up to search the town rather than moving as one group. Karl woke Dana, who found still fresh lunchboxes in the break room fridge to share, while Karl calculated the timeline from Hawk's updates: about 5 minutes until the goblins reached town, 15 to 20 before they'd reach their side of it. While eating, Karl asked Dana to try finding the academy's contact number, though she doubted it would be publicly listed. As she searched the lobby computer, Karl checked the security monitors, then realized they'd overlooked securing the building's other exits. He found an unlockable fire exit at the back and improvised a barricade using one of the cargo bars and the chain from the auto shop, wedging the bar across the hallway and looping the chain through the door handle, confident even a goblin couldn't force it open. With the building secured, Hawk reported the goblins had entered the fog and begun eliminating stray targets. Karl relayed the situation to Dana, but Hawk's next update complicated things. Rather than searching house by house, a portion of the goblins were running deeper into town through the fog, potentially heading straight for their position. Karl told Hawk to prioritize hunting, while still giving warning if anything got dangerously close. Karl repositioned scent bags to cover the lobby and a backup retreat spot near the lunchroom, hoping to mask their presence long enough to keep ambushing goblins before the tribe caught on. When Hawk warned that a group was heading straight for the town square where they were hiding, possibly having caught their scent, Karl had Dana climb onto a desk to fire from an upper window while he stepped outside to draw attention away from her position, reasoning it was better to split their exposure than let both of them be found together. Dana focused on shaping her magic missiles into non-glowing spear forms to avoid giving away her location in the dark. Karl killed his first pair of goblins outright with rend as they wandered by, deliberately letting the smell of blood draw more toward him in small, manageable numbers rather than risk facing the whole tribe at once. A second trio tried to ambush him from behind, but he cut them down easily, even at reduced power, confirming that goblins, though numerous, had soft hides no match for his attacks. Hawk applied the same efficient approach from the sky, conserving strength while working the downwind side of town so the scent of blood wouldn't drift toward goblins still looting houses, delaying their alarm. Hawk also snuck in a snack, killing an earth mouse alongside a goblin, since Karl hadn't explicitly told him not to eat his kills. As the missing tribesmen went quiet, more goblins grew suspicious and began converging on the source of the blood scent. Dana spotted a group of 4 goblins trying to sneak toward them from across the square and took out 2 before they even noticed the danger. Karl, warned by instinct, dodged a poisoned dart-tipped blowgun shot just in time, then used full-power rend to kill the shooter and its 3 companions in one strike. Dana handled the rest, and Karl gave her an approving thumbs up, while privately noting the blowgun darts as his biggest concern going forward, unsure if they carried poison in the growing darkness. Karl used the darkness to his advantage, tucking into a shadowed alcove to let the goblins' noise and the smell of blood draw them toward him, where he could see, but they couldn't. Hawk continued cutting through the tribe from above with barely any effort, exploiting the fact that goblins had no real defense against aerial predators and typically just fled or hid from birds. Dana picked off 2 more goblins at the edge of the square, while Karl spotted one hiding by a stairwell, waiting to warn the others. He leapt nearly 3 meters using the railing, startled by how far his enhanced body could jump, and killed it from above with rend before dropping down quietly to avoid drawing attention. The stillness broke when a larger group of goblins came running into the square, shouting for reinforcements as they searched for whoever was killing their tribe. Karl stepped out and cut down 2 from a block away, then scattered the approaching mob with a wide 4-strike rend sweep, turning them into easy stationary targets for Dana's magic missiles and his own smaller follow-up attacks. More goblins poured in from the fog as Hawk's hunting cries closed in overhead, driving his targets back toward Karl's position. As the enemy closed the distance too fast for ranged rend strikes, Karl switched to his blade, breaking one goblin's arm and cutting through its neck at close range, while Dana focused fire on anything trying to flank him, and Hawk worked in from behind. Fighting through several more goblins in melee, Karl found them strong for their size, but nowhere near awakened level threat, and cleared space with another wide rend sweep. Though the larger attacks were clearly draining his stamina, he fell back toward the government building, using smaller strikes to cover his retreat as the goblin pack began to break. Dana called out that she couldn't keep casting much longer, and Karl told her to seal the window and rest, taking over doorway defense himself while leaving Hawk to keep working outside. Hawk, confident and barely straining from a night of easy kills, promised to finish off the rest and was ordered to make sure nothing slipped past him into the building. With Karl standing visibly in the doorway, more goblins were lured toward him while Dana climbed down to rest in the break room, fueled by leftover roasted meat and the office's snacks and coffee. The remaining goblins hesitated to charge, still waiting for numbers before committing. Karl picked off targets steadily as Hawk reported the tribe down to fewer than 10, with a handful attempting to flee town rather than fight. Karl ordered Hawk to stop them from escaping entirely, wanting no survivors slipping away to alert others, while he held the doorway alone against the stragglers still circling nearby. He waited out one final ambush attempt, killing a goblin that tried to sneak around the corner without even turning to look. Hawk finished his sweep for the runners and confirmed the town was clear, no more targets anywhere, leaving only a door-to-door search by local authorities before residents could safely return. Karl let Hawk in through a window, then sealed the building to rest, instructing Hawk to stand watch out front until Dana relieved him in a couple of hours. Both Karl and Dana spent the next hour meditating and eating to recover their spent energy. Once rested, Karl sent Hawk on a final flyover to confirm nothing had changed, then ordered it back into the beast space to sleep for the night, confident the threat was over and planning to arrange their return to the academy in the morning. While Karl guarded the door, Dana searched the office computers and found a government emergency line. Her call to report the situation went poorly at first, the operator plainly skeptical of 2 students claiming to be academy elites reporting a cleared goblin infestation, until Dana escalated by invoking her and Karl's awakened ranks and Sergeant Rita and Professor Mills by name, confirming over 50 goblins killed and the tribe eliminated, then firmly pushed back against implied accusations of impersonating an elite, ultimately settling for a military police pickup instead of an academy transport. Karl, listening to Dana's escalating half of the conversation, couldn't hold back quiet laughter. Minutes later, the sound of approaching helicopters signaled the response team's arrival, prompting Karl to send Hawk back into the beast space to avoid any confusion with the incoming military police, with Hawk noting dryly that at least dawn was breaking, so they wouldn't be dealing with idiots who were also blind in the dark. Dana dissipated the fog over the phone to clear a landing zone, dryly pushing back when the operator questioned the unnatural weather and doubted their preparation for a power outage. Karl improvised a signal torch from a pole, rag, and grease to flag down the approaching helicopter. Rather than land, it dropped a team of armored soldiers by rope into the square, who formed a defensive perimeter despite Karl's assurance the town was already clear. The team leader had Karl scan his fingerprint to verify identity, confirming him as a Golden Divine Academy elite student with an awakened ranking still pending formal assessment. Surprised, the leader admitted the base had scrambled the team, believing kids were falsely posing as elites, unaware they'd already been scheduled to deploy and clear the town regardless. With identities confirmed, roughly 200 soldiers were inbound to sweep the town and handle the goblin corpses littering the streets. The team leader asked for coffee, and Karl pointed him to the break room, apologizing for having eaten some of the staff's lunch. The leader brushed it off, explaining that once Karl and Dana graduated, they'd get a code generator app allowing them to write reimbursement codes for anything used in service, and wrote redemption codes on napkins to pre-approve the Academy's damage claim for the borrowed food. As the rest of the team filed in and relaxed, unmasking and lining up for coffee once told the situation was genuinely resolved, one soldier grumbled about being roused at 5 in the morning over a bureaucratic mix-up. The team leader explained that the phone operators who doubted Dana were low-paid, non-elite, civilian staff prone to power tripping, and advised the pair to lead with their student ID number next time to get transferred directly to actual response teams. Assuming they were graduating seniors headed for military service, the leader was corrected. Karl and Dana were both first years in the practical skills program, Dana being groomed as an idol, sent out for unexplained training just hours after the town's evacuation, likely because the Academy assumed someone would still be there to meet them. With the mission wrapped up, all that remained was the situation being fully resolved. The Special Forces team turned their teasing toward Dana, joking that the Academy was clearly grooming her as a future archmage rather than a lasting idol, given her sharp attitude and top-tier power. Since an idol career required a fan-friendly personality she apparently lacked, Dana asked how everyone seemed to already know each other, and the team explained that with only one academy for all elites and roughly 100 students graduating at Ascended, rank or higher each year, most soon-to-be famous elites knew each other from years of shared classes after the grueling first-year cram schedule. Karl connected this to the broader hierarchy, Commander rank being the tier above Ascended, the sort of person recognized by name in their hometown, either through politics or wealth, and recalled that the lithium mine's own mayor was a commander rank warrior from the serum's early experimental trials. While waiting for the main army force to arrive, the team leader asked if they'd encountered anything stronger than common grade. Karl mentioned only the one awakened Irantusk boar, uncertain if any goblin leader had been stronger given how hard it was to tell in the dark and fog. When asked why they'd chosen to fog the town at all, seemingly complicating their own job, Karl explained the tactic favored Hawk, whose aerial vision cut through low fog while the goblins were left blind and vulnerable to ambush. The soldiers were impressed to learn Hawk was a genuine magical beast at awakened rank, rather than just a trained pet, one specifically recalling past trouble with Windspeed Hawks as dangerous nuisances. As army trucks arrived and soldiers spread out to sweep the town, radio reports began rolling in of scattered goblin corpses found one at a time across multiple streets, prompting quiet amusement from the Special Forces team who recognized the tactic. Dana's fog had hidden not just Hawk from the goblins, but also the bodies of their fallen comrades, letting the tribe keep operating obliviously while Hawk worked through them one by one. The team leader praised the coordination as clever and effective. Shortly after, the armored command vehicle rolled into the square and ran directly over a goblin corpse, smearing blood across its undercarriage, drawing a groan from Dana about the lingering smell. The team leader quietly informed them they wouldn't need to worry about riding in it, having already arranged approval with their teachers for the two to return to the academy with his unit instead. Base Commander Colonel Ryan arrived, visibly repulsed by the smell of goblin blood from his ride, but overly enthusiastic in greeting Karl and Dana, mistakenly congratulating them on a debut mission. Dana corrected him, explaining it was just an academy training exercise, which only fueled his flattery about two students handling an incident of this scale alone. The Special Forces team's visible eye rolls, caught by Karl's enhanced peripheral vision, made clear the colonel's gushing was transparent networking rather than genuine admiration. When Ryan offered to have his men finish the sweep and arrange a pickup from an older elite, the team leader smoothly declined on the students' behalf, citing prior arrangements to extract them directly to the academy and shutting down any hope of publicity events, framing it as standard security protocol. As the town filled with soldiers restoring order, cleaning blood from the streets, and even burning goblin corpses at the dump to prevent disease and erase evidence of the scale of the invasion, the common soldiers were quietly unsettled by what two first-year students had managed to accomplish, tearing through an entire tribe that would have taken their unit real effort to handle safely. The cleanup was framed publicly as prevention rather than aftermath, a deliberate political softening meant to reassure returning residents. Before departing, Karl asked about the herb scent bags that had helped mask their presence, and the team leader identified them as a common regional pest deterrent, effective against insect-type monsters, apparently working on goblins as well, likely by concealing the scent of human habitation. He offered to share the recipe, which Karl gladly accepted for further study back at the academy. With the town cleared and a cleanup crew set to finish that afternoon, the team leader wrapped things up with the colonel, promising a full report that evening, then led Karl and Dana up to the building's rooftop landing pad for extraction. Both admitted, in unison, that they'd never ridden in a helicopter before, sharing a laugh over the coincidence before strapping in for the flight back to the academy. During the flight back, the team leader confided that the mission had never been meant for goblins at all. Other student teams had simply been sent to clear a handful of magical beasts and were picked up by that afternoon. Karl and Dana pieced together how they'd stumbled onto something bigger, first mistaking the wild Irantusk boars for the whole assignment before realizing the empty houses meant the town had actually been evacuated. Dana recounted their failed attempt to call it in through the government hotline, which nearly got them reported to military police instead of believed, prompting laughs from the soldiers, who explained that contacting the academy or a military unit directly would have spared them the hassle since the hotline staff defaulted to worst-case assumptions. One of the soldiers pointed out that despite still wearing first-year common grade badges, there was no way either of them remained common grade after what they'd just done, and speculated they'd likely be promoted to black badges soon. Karl and Dana admitted the social status boost would be a welcome bonus among their fellow first years, and the veterans reminisced about how meaningful that first badge upgrade had felt in their own time, followed by the genuinely transformative jump to bronze ascended in second year, when a warrior's physical enhancements crossed into clearly superhuman territory. As the helicopter neared the academy, the pilot warned them to expect a swarm of curious classmates, given how conspicuous their arrival would be on the school's designated day off. Sure enough, students in the yard turned to watch as the helicopter descended onto the helipad, and by the time it landed, Sergeant Rita and two unfamiliar teachers, apparently mage instructors Dana recognized, were already jogging across the field to meet them, making clear their debrief would eat into the rest of their day off. Rita met Karl and Dana at the helipad, having tracked their vitals throughout the mission and knowing the town had been overrun. Karl gave a concise rundown. They'd hunted the wild boars first, cleared the roaming goblin patrol easily since it was all common grade, found no message waiting for them at the government building, then set up a fog ambush that wiped out the entire returning goblin tribe by morning before calling for extraction. The Special Forces team leader approved of the summary, but Rita informed everyone a bigger meeting was coming, since the base commander's glowing report had raised questions at the academy, specifically whether the students had falsely claimed awakened rank to the phone operator. She pulled the Special Forces team into the meeting as well, needing their account of the town's condition and the students' apparent combat readiness. The team leader offered a straightforward solution: have his own commander rank officer, Lieutenant Keyes, set up a series of power-scaled barriers to directly test Karl and Dana's output, reasoning that reaching 50% of Keys' full strength would confirm ascended level damage, and 25% would confirm awakened level. Repeating the test would also demonstrate stamina, something already strongly suggested by their overnight performance. The mage instructors welcomed the plan, since an official military-run evaluation would remove any suspicion of bias in grading their own students. They moved to the practice gym for its reinforced walls and relative privacy, though word had already spread, and the viewing boxes filled with curious students eager for details about the unusual return. Soldiers, teachers, and all on the school's off day. Karl volunteered to go first, planning to demonstrate his output alone before repeating the test with Hawk, since the evaluation was meant to measure his own individual capability first. Keys set up the graduated barriers alongside sensor equipment to measure Karl's output. Karl shattered the first two barriers instantly with full power rend, but the third visibly dimmed his attack, and the fourth barely collapsed. Realizing pure rend alone wouldn't clear the higher barriers, he switched tactics, coating his gauntlet claws with the skill and physically striking instead, cracking the fifth barrier over 3 hits. He then unleashed 10 straight minutes of combined claw and rend attacks against the 6th barrier, leaving visible marks that kept reforming, but it never broke before exhaustion forced him to stop. The Special Forces team leader confirmed the results were solid awakened rank, since Karl could reliably break the 3rd barrier repeatedly and only failed at the 5th and 6th, even with everything combined. Still short of the minimum ascended threshold, which would require one-shotting the 5th barrier consistently, the teaching staff formally promoted Karl to awakened rank on the spot. Dana went next. The team leader explained to Karl why single-shot power mattered most for this test. A real enemy mage or magical beast would actively reinforce their barrier under sustained attack, so only a one-strike breakthrough proved genuine combat effectiveness against a live defender. Since magic missile wasn't naturally suited to concentrated single-target damage, Dana condensed her mana into one full power bolt, shattering the first 3 barriers cleanly. The professors allowed her to split her casting into multiple simultaneous missiles without penalty, and her 4-missile barrage against the 4th barrier partially broke through, with 2 bolts reaching the target, but the 5th barrier held firm no matter what combination of sustained fire or heavy single strikes she tried. Satisfied she demonstrated genuine awakened level output and stamina, the teachers promoted her to awakened rank mage as well, prompting cheers from the gathered students and the presentation of black embroidered badges. Rita immediately reminded both of them, along with a Special Forces team member she singled out by name, that their mission reports were still due, drawing laughter from the team. Karl privately reflected on the rarity of 2 successful awakenings occurring within the same family, wondering if certain bloodlines simply carried better compatibility with the serum, the kind of advantage the self-styled blessed noble families quietly relied on. Rita dropped Karl and Dana into a classroom with the Special Forces team to write mission reports, demanding at least 1,000 words each before either student could leave. The team leader teased one of his own men about Rita being his intimidating cousin, revealing a running joke that predated actually meeting her in person. Everyone settled into writing, with Karl and the other warriors typing quickly thanks to their enhanced reflexes despite average typing skill. Once finished, the team leader remarked on how unusual it was for a first mission to involve solo clearing an entire goblin tribe, prompting a joke about another former student, Jenny, whose own infamous first mission story involved meeting a mystery elite in the woods and returning pregnant. Dana recognized the name, Jenny Starpepper, as being from her hometown, and the group traded gossip about her now-grown son, rumored to have inherited an uncontrollable berserker rage skill from his father, requiring mittens as a child to keep him from clawing people, though Jenny herself was now married to a banker with 2 other, more conventionally adorable kids. While waiting for Rita to return, the team leader asked to meet Hawk. Karl summoned him out, and Dana won him over instantly with a piece of jerky. One soldier's ability read Hawk as an awakened rank Windspeed Hawk barely a month old, remarking that was far too young for such rapid maturity. Karl explained Hawk's growth was accelerated by his class abilities, having hatched the bird on the train ride to the academy. The soldier, whose own talent involved hunting knowledge for creatures he'd observed, explained that all magical beasts grow according to what they eat, instinctively seeking stronger food sources to advance, and that truly powerful beasts were rare largely because sufficiently strong food was scarce in most regions. Karl was intrigued and mentioned he'd already noticed improved nutrient absorption lately and was considering requesting higher-ranked food to push Hawk's growth further. The soldier warned him not to overdo it, since too large a gap between the body's current tolerance and the resource's potency could backfire, causing an inability to absorb anything at all, much like his very first days before his body adapted. Karl reasoned through why most Windspeed Hawks never surpassed awakened rank. Their staple prey, earth mice, capped out at common-grade nutrition, and hunting anything bigger risked drawing scavengers and competing predators into their territory, trapping them in a cycle of limited-quality food and slow, capped growth. He recognized that with Academy support, even a single rank increase in Hawk's usual food quality could trigger another growth spurt, making that his top priority request alongside more mana-infused blood with strength stones, Hawk's favorite. He noted Hawk's actual food needs had dropped sharply since reaching maturity, now relying more on Karl's transferred energy than sheer volume of meat, with the stockpiled boar meat likely to last months since it didn't spoil in the beast's space. While at the computers, Karl decided to send a letter home through the local mayor, since his parents had no phone or computer. The team leader reminded him most details about the academy, its location, and his training would be censored before reaching outsiders, which Karl was fine with, wanting only to reassure his parents. The soldiers shared their own working-class backgrounds and habits of sending money home, bonding briefly over shared origins before both Karl and Dana wrote simple, unredacted friendly letters, Dana omitting how loud her dorm actually was, Karl keeping his light and cheerful about his growth spurt and new friendships. With the letters sent for Academy review, Karl turned to the next task, working out a new diet plan for Hawk with the kitchen staff. The team leader offered some perspective, noting that as third-generation serum recipients themselves, they'd had no roadmap, either when they trained, and that progression tended to align with a class's core nature, focus and practice for mages, connection to nature for hunters and druids, and for Karl, most likely centered on Hawk's continued growth. He also mentioned a newer development. Classes weren't strictly tied to the serum injection anymore. Some could be taught to older, untreated people with latent potential, and others could be inherited by children, hinting that future efforts might focus on deliberately optimizing which classes went to which candidates. Dana grew excited at the idea of teachable classes, wondering if it could produce a whole corps of golem mages for military and construction use. The team leader clarified, the bigger goal was finding something teachable to people incompatible with the serum entirely, noting attempts to teach sword or magic skills to non-compatible students had failed so far, likely due to lacking mana, though he brushed off the topic as too far in the future for 2 first years to worry about. The conversation cut short when Sergeant Rita returned with the headmaster, the old transportation mage, and 2 men in expensive suits, revealed to be Royal Prince Axel and Overlord Drake. Everyone scrambled into hasty bows, Karl unsure if he was doing it correctly, while Drake waved off formality, explaining they'd come to meet the promising new students and hear their first-hand reaction to real monster threats. Karl admitted goblins were mostly just disgusting rather than terrifying, especially once dead, and Dana agreed, noting their filth overpowered any real sense of fear. Drake seemed mildly surprised, having expected more shock, while Prince Axel admitted he'd personally never encountered a goblin despite years since graduating. Hawk, confused about the social hierarchy since Drake was clearly the stronger fighter, asked Karl why the prince seemed to outrank him. Karl explained the prince's authority came from his family's rule over the region rather than personal combat power, a distinction Hawk understood by comparing it to the cub of a powerful predator. Before leaving, the prince asked the headmaster how the 2 standout students could be supported further. The headmaster suggested Dana, a standard magic missile mage like the prince himself, might benefit from his own experience or access to the royal library, while noting Karl's unique beast-bonded class made outside help harder to offer. Learning Dana only knew magic missile and fog bank, Prince Axel offered to send her a personal spell tome he'd created using his inscription skills, one that could grant instant proficiency in a new spell to anyone compatible with it, promising to have it delivered to her room later. Drake then offered Karl a similar red leather-bound skill tome containing a wide-area attack technique the Academy was hoping to teach all its warriors by their 2nd year, valued for its bleeding effect on surviving targets. When Karl asked its name, Drake answered, Rend. Karl had to point out the obvious problem. Rend was already his sole known skill, the innate ability of the Windspeed Hawk itself. Overlord Drake offered Karl something better suited to a Windspeed Hawk than Rend itself, Shred, an advanced upgrade known for causing jagged wounds that resisted natural healing. Hawk was initially offended at the suggestion anything could top Rend, but accepted Karl's reassurance that it was simply a stronger version used by more powerful creatures. The headmaster produced a spare silver-trimmed tome on the spot, and the moment Karl opened it, power surged through him, instantly granting both himself and Hawk the Shred skill at full activation strength. With no gradual learning curve, Hawk immediately showed off the physical mark of the new power, red feathers now streaking through its legs. The book itself vanished the instant it was used. A mechanic, Drake noted, had devastated the inscriptionist teams who first discovered their creations would just disappear into the recipient rather than remain usable by the crafter. Drake and Prince Axel explained the deeper limitations. Only classes with compatible marks could use a given tome. The rules governing compatibility poorly understood even by the nobility, and functional tomes could only be produced from an original working copy or with direct help from an elite who'd already mastered the skill well enough to teach it. Currently, only a handful of advanced skills, including Rend, Shred, and Golem, had tomes in circulation, since simpler skills like Guard and Slash could just be taught conventionally. Curious, the prince handed Dana an untested Vine Whip tome recovered from ancient ruins, one compatible with his own mark but never tried on anyone outside the druid class before. Karl reasoned aloud that the animal affinity marks, like the paw-marked guard he'd met on the train, would naturally suit nature-based spells, while mage compatibility likely tracked with their first spell, prompting the prince to agree that everyone seemed to have an innate niche. Though no reliable method existed yet to predict a class's full range of usable skills without direct trial and error, before he could elaborate further, servants interrupted with news of an urgent matter at the capital requiring the prince's immediate departure. As a parting gesture, he instructed that Dana be given a copy of the Golem spell to test before they left. Dana hesitantly opened the Golem tome, and it vanished as she absorbed the spell, bringing her total repertoire to 3. Casting it produced a nude white marble statue Golem, prompting an embarrassed blush before the professor stopped her from dismissing it, explaining that a stone golem was strong and versatile, second only to iron, and that the human form clarity itself signaled superior mana control, granting it monster-level physical strength and agility at her rank. Prince Axel teased that she could dress it properly once she learned mage armor. Karl recognized the design from the detailed training golems his old teammates had encountered on their first day, distinct from the cruder clay, wood, and sand golems most students typically summoned. When Dana asked how the statue would hold up against magic, the professor confirmed the stone itself was magically reinforced, resistant to both regular weapons and most awakened-level spells. Karl joked about losing his numerical and power advantage, while Hawk eyed the stone golem warily, instinctively recognizing a rival for its position as top pet, though it took some comfort in the fact that the golem couldn't fly and steal its scouting role. Rita reassured Karl that once a suitable second beast was found, he could expand his own team similarly, though his growth rate already outpaced most classmates by a wide margin. Overlord Drake, clearly fond of birds, offered to get Academy approval for testing higher rank resources on Hawk, including Ascended and Commander-grade monster blood mixed with strength stones, a combination already proven in lab testing to sustain steady growth until a creature reached its natural potential. Karl welcomed the help, since Hawk's growth translated directly into his own, and noted Hawk's confidence in eventually reaching commander rank with enough support. Drake praised that confidence as essential, warning that losing it bred cowardice and was difficult to reverse once it took hold, hinting that the intimidating aura strong elites projected wasn't just posturing, but partly a self-reinforcing mental discipline. With the prince's assistance signaling time pressure, Karl and Dana bowed as the royals wrapped up, Axel reminding them to dismiss Dana's golem before leaving, since they weren't permitted in the hallways. Once the officials departed, Rita congratulated the students on how well the encounter had gone, urging them to eat and meditate to properly consolidate their new gains, warning that even instantly learned skillbook abilities could be unstable the first few uses. The Special Forces team leader added dryly that none of them could speak from experience, since these skill tomes hadn't existed publicly during their own time at the academy. Karl and Dana were immediately swarmed the moment they entered the cafeteria, students eager to hear how a 1-hour mission had turned into an overnight ordeal ending in an army helicopter. Karl explained the communication failure. The town was supposed to hold only wild Irantusk boars, but goblins had overrun it an hour before their departure, too late for the update to reach the academy, leaving them dropped into an empty town with no real instructions. They'd simply cleared every threat they found and waited, eventually calling it in themselves once they confirmed the goblins were dead. When pressed about their sudden black badges, Dana explained the Special Forces team had vouched for them, letting them test for awakened rank immediately rather than waiting for the semester's end, and both passed. Other students grumbled about missing the same opportunity, though one pair was quickly reminded of their own near-disastrous encounter with a single shadow cat, complete with stitches and a lost sword, undercutting any claim they could have handled a full goblin tribe. Karl and Dana spent nearly 2 hours recounting the fight in exhaustive detail, the crowd wanting a moment-by-moment retelling far beyond what even Rita's official report required. Along with the fame came black badge perks, weekly extra credits for room upgrades and lifestyle improvements. Dana immediately planned to soundproof her room, while Karl found himself stumped. His greenhouse suite already felt complete. Uniforms left no room for personal fashion, and the main resource he actually wanted, funding for Hawk, was coming free through Drake's promise regardless. Walking back to the dorms through hallways, loud with first years frantically training on their day off, spurred by news of the pair's sudden promotion, Dana dreaded another sleepless night. Karl offered the quiet hammock on his balcony as an escape, immediately recognizing how the invitation sounded, but knowing it was the practical solution given how badly she needed rest. The whole first-year class was scrambling in reaction to the promotion news, terrified of being left behind as the academy's curriculum funneled the top third of students into accelerated special training while the rest fell into the standard track. Karl and Dana were already firmly in that upper tier, with Dana likely to gain her own personal tutor soon, and their visible closeness as a pair was starting to stir quiet jealousy among classmates, alongside the envy over their newfound status. Karl woke to laughter and noise on his balcony, finding Dana training her golem in makeshift martial arts, while Hawk perched on its head shouting unhelpful directions neither the golem nor Dana could actually understand. Dana explained she'd spent the night on the enchanted hammock, feeling unusually refreshed despite limited sleep, and had spent the morning watering the plants with Hawk before testing her new golem spell. Since the golem responded to mental commands, but she had no combat knowledge to guide it, she asked Karl for help refining its technique, and he offered to bring her into his fighting classes, since his own gauntlet-based style was close enough to martial arts to translate. They settled for an impromptu lesson instead, working through basic stances and guard positions, with the golem picking up movement patterns quickly thanks to the spell's built-in adaptiveness, retaining what it learned even after being dismissed and resummoned. Karl and the golem shadowboxed at reduced power for practice, and Karl noted he hadn't actually been injured in training since his absorption efficiency improved, though a full-strength stone punch remained untested. After showering and eating, Karl's day only got harder. Sergeant Rita informed him that his new awakened rank status came with real responsibilities. As an official elite, even while still a student, he was now theoretically eligible to be called out for emergency response duty off campus, though a long waiting list of senior students angling for the credits and resources meant it wouldn't happen soon. She walked him through practical protocols he'd missed on his first mission, including leading emergency calls with his student ID number to skip the useless call center staff and contacting the elite force at the airbase directly instead. She also revealed that other elites in the area had been available to help during the Goblin incident, but hadn't responded, since the evacuated town meant no civilians were at risk, letting the military take its time. Karl privately thought it would have made more sense to just clear the whole threat in one sweep rather than let the goblins loot overnight, but let it go, resigned instead to the mountain of new procedural information Rita expected him to memorize before dinner and beyond. Karl found the emergency protocols mostly straightforward common sense, condensing the key numbers and steps onto a laminated cue card he picked up on his way to dinner. At the cafeteria, a second-year mage teased him about his new elite status, and Karl deflected credit to Hawk. When asked whether his promotion meant leaving the morning mage training class, Karl explained he'd stay, since his real edge was accelerated learning speed rather than raw combat class placement. Though his close combat sparring partners would change, the other mages laughed at the absurdity of one student single-handedly blocking attacks from 24 classmates. Acknowledging Ren's ability to split into multiple simultaneous strikes gave Karl and Hawk an unfair precision advantage even at equal power levels. That evening, Dana was waiting the moment Karl returned to the dorms, already packed for another night, studying on his quiet balcony since her requested soundproofing wasn't affordable without another high-level mission's worth of credits. Karl sympathized, noting even the hallways were loud enough to explain why senior students preferred studying outside their rooms entirely. Elsewhere, academy administrators monitored the pair's growing closeness through security feeds. One board member worried aloud about the possibility of a premature pregnancy and suggested separating the two for the sake of their career tracks. But the headmaster dismissed the concern, trusting their character and noting free contraception and counselor-recommended birth control were already available. When another member suggested installing cameras in the greenhouse room to monitor their training, the headmaster firmly refused, citing a personal policy against surveillance in student dorms, reasoning that exposing an elite's private training methods and weaknesses could create real danger from human enemies down the line. The board debated whether to formally separate Karl and Dana's career paths. The lead researcher argued for letting the Beastmaster and Mage continue training together, framing their bond as useful leverage to keep Karl compliant with future testing on his beast bonding abilities, but was bluntly countered by the older board member, who doubted that having a friend would make Karl accept genuinely dangerous research rather than simply refusing to cooperate. When the researcher floated, sending Dana along with him specifically to that end, the celebrity development officer flatly refused, citing an already planned multi-thousand-hour idle career pipeline for her. The lone military officer on the board pushed back on that framing entirely, arguing Dana's growing power as a mage meant real missions should be built into her schedule regardless of her marketability, and warned that if she reached commander rank before graduation, she'd hold too much authority for the entertainment industry to control anyway. Unaware of the elders' scheming, Karl and Dana kept grinding through their training. Dana's fine mana control work with Hawk kept paying off, while Karl's growth showed no sign of slowing despite no new resources arriving since his promotion, as if his class was simply hitting a natural maturation phase, the way his body had in his first weeks at the academy. Dana focused on training her golem into a proper frontline combatant, while Karl kept refining Hawk's mental living space, noticing subtle but real improvements, glossier feathers, better overall condition, even though nothing had actually been wrong with Hawk to begin with. Since almost no research existed on these minor progression markers in monsters, Karl could only estimate that Hawk was a few months out from ascended rank, when its claws would darken and gain a glossy sheen, with his own body growing visibly leaner and more athletic in response. A welcome change for someone who'd always been a late bloomer physically. Their week settled into a routine of standard classes plus a new addition, Rita's social adaptation lessons, covering etiquette, geography, and protocol for interacting with powerful or reclusive elites, including obscure figures who technically warranted invitations to major events despite near-certain no-shows, the reclusive headmaster himself being a prime example. At the next weekly special class gathering, two new first-year mages, Jenna and Brittany, were introduced to the group, and the numbers no longer added up evenly, signaling a swap. The teacher, visibly annoyed at the bureaucratic interference, announced that Karl and Dana were being reassigned to a program focused on individual and small group missions under the Bureau of Elite Development's oversight and would be training under a new instructor going forward, Colonel Valerie Boris, who sharply corrected her own name after the old professor botched it. Boris cut, an intimidatingly rigid figure, immaculately starched uniform, shaved undercut, gold aviator glasses, projecting strict military discipline despite looking barely into her 20s. She curtly insisted on being addressed as Professor Valerie, accepted their greeting without warmth, and led them away without further explanation. While Rita conspicuously avoided any acknowledgement of the handoff, Hawk, unimpressed, grumbled privately that this new teacher seemed far more humorless than Rita, doubting she even believed in snacks. Professor Valerie drove Karl and Dana off campus in a military sedan, revealing, once they were out of sight of the academy, that her real affiliation was the Bureau of Elite Development, a division of the National Security Agency, tasked with training them as an operational pair outside the academy's usual restrictions. She dismissively noted that Rita, while competent, coddled her students too much for this next phase, and confirmed both students had absorbed their newly learned skills over the weekend. They arrived at a warehouse outside town, where a friendly driver reassured them Valerie was easier to handle than she seemed. Inside, they met 10 other pairs of elites, mostly plainclothes investigators for the Bureau, who greeted Valerie with sharp military salutes. She bluntly laid out the Academy Board's plans for the two students in front of the room: Dana's entertainment then messaging career track, Karl's designation as a test subject for his unique beast bonding class, leaving both visibly stunned at how thoroughly their futures had already been mapped out just weeks into their first year. One investigator asked if this was simply an introduction to elite society, but Valerie clarified their purpose was paired small group combat training, given both students fast track toward awakened and likely eventual commander rank. Another pair joked about deliberately steering the pair off their planned life path, amused by the prospect. Valerie explained that everyone present was a bureau investigator, operating in pairs both to mentor promising elites and to monitor and support established ones through growth bottlenecks, making them ideal instructors for coordinated combat. She mentioned some of their scheduled academy days might eventually shift to this training center if deeper instruction was warranted. One woman draped a friendly arm around Dana, promising more fun than standard classes, though Valerie tempered expectations, noting their last mission had already escalated into wiping out an entire goblin tribe, a bar unlikely to be topped by routine training. She highlighted a key advantage the group offered. Nala, an inscriptionist among them, could produce instant skill tomes once the pair mastered enough foundational spells, and revealed plans for an upcoming expedition to find a high-potential infant monster to pair with Hawk, since the Bureau was specifically interested in whether Karl could successfully bond and gain power from a second monster. The Bureau team dropped the formality quickly, treating Karl and Dana like colleagues rather than students. One warrior noted they'd normally start skills training with near graduates who already had half a dozen abilities, assuming the two newcomers only had one each, until Karl clarified he now had 2 thanks to Drake's tome, and Dana had 3 between her base magic missile fog and the new golem spell. Josh, one of the warriors, joked about their fast track to fame meeting royalty already, and Anise, a ginger-haired soldier, introduced herself as their adaptation skills instructor, explaining that creative use of even basic spells mattered more than raw power. She demonstrated by describing how fog could be condensed into a tight ring to create a solid visual barrier, useful for breaking pursuit in an alley, obscuring which buildings someone entered, or even causing a vehicle chase to crash. Dana, startled, asked if elites got into that much conflict, and Anise explained the Bureau's dual role, guiding elites toward power responsibly, while also handling those who went rogue, became abusive or needed correction, techniques that doubled effectively against smart monsters like mithril tigers, which were nearly impossible to shake once tracking someone, and dangerous even to commander rank pairs caught in the open. The group split, mages working with Dana, while the warriors gathered around Karl. One soldier asked if he could hold Rend stationary rather than as a moving strike, and Karl demonstrated by coating his gauntlets in the effect, understanding the basic concept already. Pushed further, he successfully anchored a beam of Rend energy between 2 pillars like a tripwire, which the soldiers tested by tossing a metal bar through it, cleanly slicing it in 2. Karl was startled by how lethal the effect was, though he noted the technique required active concentration to hold, since Rend naturally resisted staying stationary, and Shred would likely be even harder to stabilize. The soldiers reassured him the real value was in setting snares and trip lines to block pursuing monsters or buy time to regroup and escape rather than sustain combat use. When asked if he'd grown up around monster-infested woods, Karl corrected them. He was from the mines, where the real daily fear was cave-ins, joking that his priorities had always been simple: not dying first, getting the job done second. The rest of the day focused on refining Rend's applications, both stabilizing it as a stationary trap and disguising its form entirely, since some monsters, like tusked beasts that could tank a direct hit, could learn to counter the skill's usual streak shape. Shaping it instead as a disc or spear could throw off that recognition, the same principle Dana had already applied by dimming her magic missiles mid-fight. Colonel Valerie ended the session precisely at 4, true to her rigid nature, and the group wrapped up with light teasing about assembling a formal lesson plan for the pair. The drive back was quiet, both students mentally drained from a day spent forcing themselves to think about their skills in unfamiliar ways rather than simply absorbing new knowledge. Karl found the mental flexibility required more exhausting than physical training, and was relieved his next day was open for rest and practice. Back on campus, Valerie shifted seamlessly back into her friendly Professor Valerie persona, asking how they'd found the first session. Karl admitted the day had reshaped how he thought about using Rend, useful against enemies like the Goblin tribe going forward, while Hawk mentally fixated on using Tripwire Rend to lure and gut-charging prey, particularly pigs, until Karl told it to go get a snack instead. Dana looked forward to testing her Golem and Magic Missile combo late into the night, amused at the thought of finally out-noising her own loud neighbors, while Karl planned to prioritize raw power over control for the evening, since the stretching techniques had drained him mentally more than physically. Remembering he had leftover credits from the mission, Karl stopped by the supply room to request awakened or ascended rank resources for Hawk. The clerk warned him not to overdo the concentration of any strengthening mixture right after a breakthrough, advising a diluted starting dose. Checking Karl's credit balance, the clerk found he could only afford either an ascended rank strength stone alone or a full awakened rank set of both stone and blood, not the higher tier combination. Karl opted for the ascended stone, planning to mix it with the half-liter or more of awakened boar blood he already had stored from the mission, more than enough to last Hawk for weeks. He asked for the stone ground fine for better mixing, and the transaction wrapped up with the clerk vanishing into the back room, leaving Karl holding a small bag of powder that, out of context, looked distinctly like a drug deal. Karl mixed the ground ascended stone into a bowl of boar blood for Hawk, who drank it eagerly and stirred it with his claws to spread the effect evenly across his meat, like dipping chicken. Karl meditated through the night as the concoction worked, feeding strength back into his own body and mind. By morning, Hawk casually referred to Rita by her actual rank instead of his usual evil lady nicknames, a small but telling sign to Karl that the bird's intelligence was steadily sharpening. With the weekly day off ahead and nothing major scheduled, supply staff arrived early with a shipment of upgraded food products for Hawk, various meats, infused sausages, and a claw conditioning ointment. Testing revealed Hawk's tastes clearly. He refused anything plant-based, including a wiggly tofu-like cube, but devoured the spicy and cheese sausages enthusiastically, despite the mess. Karl logged each reaction carefully, noting the spicy sausages in particular gave Hawk a stimulant-like hyperactive boost that the bird himself didn't seem to notice, though his thinking stayed clear, just faster and more distractible. The rejected items were still edible, but unremarkable, and Karl tried them himself afterward, spending the leftover energy meditating before turning to greenhouse chores, watering plants, and harvesting the berry bushes and tea trees, which were proving to be his most consistently productive plants. After lunch, Karl continued expanding Hawk's mental beast space, now developed enough to include a full clearing of grass around the original tree. Hawk requested a small lake next for fishing practice, which Karl began shaping the same way he'd grown the grass. During the work, both noticed the space itself seemed to be steadily expanding, Hawk recalling that his old flight loops around the tree used to be much tighter, now stretching into minutes before needing to turn back. Hawk floated the idea that at higher power levels, the space might eventually become an entire world of its own. Karl considered this seriously, noting the space's density seemed to scale linearly with effort, while its overall size appeared to have jumped unpredictably at some point without him noticing. One more pattern to track as he tried to understand how his class actually worked. Dana came over to study, but Hawk, still buzzing with excess energy from his new diet, wanted to train skill control together instead of resting, giving Dana a break to work through new techniques between rounds, while Karl expanded the beast space's puddle into a full pond. By mid-afternoon, restless, Karl suggested exploring the Academy's other off-day facilities beyond training, settling on the movie lounge over the crowded pool to avoid the attention their recent fame was drawing. They ended up watching an action movie a group of girls had put on repeat for the third time that day, then took dinner to the balcony to watch the sunset, something that struck Karl as suspiciously close to an actual date, though before he could say anything, Dana fell asleep mid-meditation in her chair. He moved her to the hammock and let the evening end quietly. The next morning's training brought a genuine breakthrough. Karl modified Rend into a perpendicular grid pattern, sacrificing range and stability for area coverage, able to knock out 5 or 6 spells from a full volley of 20 at minimal energy cost, though it couldn't be redirected once cast. The mages were impressed, despite some confusion over whether it still counted as the same skill, and the instructor agreed it would be a nightmare for anyone relying on evasion rather than blocking. At lunch, The group got their first close look at Hawk's new red-streaked feathers from learning Shred, and a mage's tablet analysis flagged the change as an outright mutation rather than a normal strength-based progression, unprecedented for the species. One mage theorized the new skill itself may have pushed Hawk past a racial growth ceiling most Windspeed Hawks never broke through. Karl agreed, confidently predicting Hawk could reach commander rank well before graduation, a claim that visibly unsettled his classmates, none of whom expected to reach even ascended by then, let alone the rank above it. At afternoon training, Rita greeted Karl with poorly concealed irritation, clearly annoyed not at him personally, but at having her authority as his primary mentor overridden by the Bureau's involvement. Karl carefully avoided giving her any reason to escalate, describing the Bureau's pair-focused training as simply different rather than better. In apparent retaliation, or genuine training necessity, Rita reassigned his combat partner to Tank, the hulking berserker instructor, tasking Karl with helping demonstrate unarmed and agility techniques against berserker-type opponents, a pairing Karl immediately suspected was less about pedagogy and more about Rita venting her frustration. Professor Tank opened the demonstration by having Karl attack alongside Hawk. Karl launched a cross-rend pattern while going for a knee sweep, and Hawk's shred struck the back of Tank's helmet in near-perfect coordination. But the hit to the head triggered Tank's berserker rage skill, nullifying Karl's leg sweep entirely and letting Tank casually backhand him across the training ground. Tank used the failure to teach the class about Unstoppable, a common berserker skill that made any part of their body equal in mass to their entire frame, meaning normal takedowns simply didn't work, and warned that head strikes specifically triggered rage, multiplying their power and speed further. He explained the actual counter strategy. Instead of throws or sweeps, students needed to target soft tissue and nerve clusters repeatedly, wearing down accumulated damage until rage eventually faded and pain caught up. Karl summarized it as avoiding leg sweeps and headshots while grinding through hits, and Tank confirmed it, adding that groin and face strikes were also off-limits in training, not because they wouldn't work, but because they tended to spike the rage response unpredictably. Karl also learned berserkers' extreme height, well beyond normal human limits, was natural rather than class-granted, with only their muscle mass enhanced by the class itself. On his second attempt, Karl targeted Tank's kidney and had Hawk strike his lower back and knees, avoiding the head entirely, and managed to land a solid hit before being launched again. Though this time he recovered gracefully, Tank used the moment to stress that even an awakened rank agility fighter could have ribs shattered by a berserker of equal rank, since their armored melee power rivaled or exceeded other classes despite typically relying on weapons. On the third exchange, Karl adapted further, using rend defensively as a deflecting barrier rather than just an attack, redirecting one of Tank's punches upward, with Hawk striking the elbow to fully throw off the strike's trajectory. This opened Tank's side, letting Karl land 3 quick rend slashes while Hawk harassed his exposed torso, forcing him to defend with only one arm. Tank praised the combo, noting that against an opponent his own rank wearing equivalent armor, that exact sequence could have taken off a limb and opened them up entirely, though his own advanced armor shrugged it off as a passing bruise. When a monk-class student complained about lacking slicing abilities like rend, Tank called him up next to demonstrate pressure point tactics instead, giving Karl a break, while the class watched their unlucky classmates step forward, silently grateful it wasn't them. Unaware Tank's berserker physiology meant he wouldn't even register the coming bruises as pain. Tank spent the rest of the session cycling through the class, and Karl remained the only student who genuinely posed a challenge, since the others' grappling and submission-focused styles were useless against Unstoppable. Karl recognized the broader value of the lesson beyond just berserkers, reasoning the same tactics would apply to giant humanoid monsters like orcs, trolls, and ogres, though unlike Tank's armor, their exposed bodies might actually let rend cut through cleanly if the power gap wasn't too extreme. Watching Tank effortlessly toy with the first years while genuinely struggling against a few visiting ascended rank seniors, the class began to suspect he'd taken the teaching position purely as an outlet for his battle-hungry nature between actual monster hunts. The instructor closed the day, reminding everyone to internalize the lessons before Tank's return later that week. Heading back to study monster biology, Karl was intercepted by Colonel Valerie, who pulled him into another bureau session before dinner. In a private classroom, a warrior mage pair from the earlier training day had laid out an unsettling spread of pills, injections, and prepared foods. Karl questioned the risk of combining so many treatments at once, and Valerie admitted flatly that that they weren't certain how many, if any, would even work on him, prompting a joking jab from her subordinate about her deadpan reputation for heartlessness. Valerie clarified the logic. Each treatment targeted an aptitude Karl had already shown above-average potential in: mental stimulants typically used on psychic and visualization-type mages, magical steroid-equivalent injections, and specially prepared foods meant to trigger skill comprehension breakthroughs. They started with the mental treatment, reasoning that since Karl's meditation directly improved the beast space, cognitive enhancement should benefit both him and Hawk simultaneously. Karl took a dragonite pill made from crystallized ancient dragon bone and typically used to boost mages' mana growth and mental capacity. It dissolved instantly, flooding his mind with a surge of golden light and visibly accelerating the beast space's growth in real time. Hawk absorbed much of the excess energy as it settled, and the effect stabilized into a milder but still noticeable improvement. Impressed that the treatment benefited both bonded partners at once, Valerie's team began discussing doubling future doses, reasoning that since energy split between Karl and Hawk, standard single doses might be too diluted to fully trigger some of the remaining treatments. The team moved on to a full array of pills, minus the irreplaceable dragonite. The next two produced only a mild mental clarity boost, disappointing everyone present. The following pill, however, proved far more potent, instantly clarifying Karl's understanding of rend and shred, making them more efficient and faster to activate, while giving Hawk parallel insight into Windshield, granting Karl faint glimpses of a skill he couldn't use yet through their shared bond. Valerie noted results on that pill varied wildly between subjects and flagged Karl's file for more once he'd learned additional skills. The next pill was outright rejected by his body in a burst of expelled energy, despite having a nearly identical intended effect to the successful one, an anomaly the mage carefully logged rather than immediately explaining, ruling out simple saturation since full treatment courses were normally given without issue. A few more mental pills passed, with no noticeable effect, until the final item, a crystallized mana drop from a high-ranking beast, caught Hawk's attention instantly. Rather than let Karl eat it, Hawk snatched it into the beast space to absorb slowly over time, reasoning it would work better there than sitting undigested in Karl's stomach. With the pills finished, Valerie moved on to the injectable treatments, warning Karl about half would require needles. The mage teased her openly about being cold enough that even Karl's improved mental clarity now let him understand why swearing internally was the only sane way to deal with her, revealing an underlying friendship beneath the colonel's rigid exterior. Karl stripped down for the injection, warned bluntly that it would hurt, and it did, a searing burn tearing up his arm and across his chest. The mage fed him a restorative drink mid-reaction, and as the pain faded and the absorbed energy redirected into the beast space, Hawk exploded in size without warning, jumping from hawk-sized to larger than a condor. In seconds, a gangly, starving giant frantically devouring the stored meat to catch up to its own sudden growth. Karl asked for a pause to let Hawk stabilize before continuing, and Valerie agreed to hold off on the second dose, though Karl already suspected she had no intention of abandoning a treatment showing this much promise. After half an hour of recovery and a special shipment of monster meat, Karl's pain finally faded enough for the second injection round to begin. This time, the burn hit his left side, and while Hawk didn't grow further, his body filled out with proper muscle mass, restoring his proportions while keeping his larger size. Hawk immediately outgrew his nest, forcing Karl to hastily reshape it, and as the stone in the nest kept feeding power into the space, growth plateaued unexpectedly, splitting off into a second, empty space Hawk couldn't enter himself. Karl realized this likely meant his class could now support bonding a second beast, a possibility that visibly excited the 3 bureau workers watching, since a second pet would multiply his effective combat power. Karl then discovered the injections had actually been delivered in 2 full 6-shot rounds, rather than 1 at a time, as he'd assumed, explaining the intensity of the pain. Hawk emerged noticeably larger, over 1 meter tall, with a 3-meter wingspan. Though his claws hadn't yet turned the telltale translucent color of ascended rank, confirming he wasn't there yet, despite the physical mutation. The team noted, this kind of deliberate forced growth outcome had never been documented for a Windspeed Hawk before, likely because no one had previously been reckless enough to try it on a wild one. A proposed claw strength test against a barrier was called off due to room size and Ren's power, postponed until the next day, with the team realizing over 2 hours had passed during the treatment session. Moving to the final phase, food-based treatments meant to trigger skill insights, Hawk rejected the offerings outright since none contained meat and retreated to rest. Karl worked through them alone. Most did nothing noticeable, but one tasting like welded steel gave him insight into Slash, letting him understand it as a stripped-down, more energy-efficient version of Rend. Essentially Rend without the bleeding effect, just the base sword-like strike. Another, tasting like stone dust, triggered a flicker of golem spell recognition before his body flatly rejected it. Incompatible despite the familiar magical sensation, a reaction the mage found notable enough to flag for further investigation, theorizing his bond with Hawk might make him unusually sensitive to magic types, not native to his class. With that, Valerie declared the day's special programming complete and arranged for a fresh uniform before sending Karl back to his room. That's all for this video. We'll be back again with another one soon, so drop a like and do subscribe if you enjoyed it and want more of the same.